I never loved my stepbrother. Truthfully, I can't even say that I liked him, but by no means did he deserve his fate. Whatever it may have been. I'm putting my memories to paper now, as best I can recall them, before the pills and therapy snatch them away forever. We became family when I was 6 years of age. My mother died when I was barely out of infancy, and my father, in loneliness and grief, turned towards the first woman who showed an inkling of interest, or at least tolerance. After a long and tumultuous romance, they tied their vows and almost immediately began to make each other miserable, a theme which resonated between my new brother and me. Daniel wasn't a literal monster, but in the eyes of a younger sibling, he may well could have been. 2 years my senior, I grew up dreading the inevitability of a daily teasing or beating, knowing the hopelessness that he would try to make my everyday miserable. One instance sticks out in particular now, perhaps resurfacing by the irony of the recent events that's caused my incarceration. We grew up in a small country town, and our backyard consisted of a massive forest, which stretched as far as a child could wander. I spent many hours in the woods, and where most children might feel lost or scared in the wild, I felt safe from the conflicts that ravaged my home, away from Daniel and the evil woman that he called Mother. Not too far into the woods, just up the hill, and through a thick bramble, was a pond of a decent size, old and stagnant and covered in green film of algae. While most of the forest was a comfort, the pond always bothered me. I hated everything about it, from its sickly green appearance to the faintly putrid stench that the still water produced. But as it was wide enough to cover a large stretch of the forest, it was necessary to pass by it during my hikes. One day, while I was unaware, my stepbrother decided to follow me. He stalked me through the forest as I explored, just out of sight, like a predator on the hunt. As I paused by the pond to gather stones, Daniel silently closed the gap between us, creeping between the trees as he approached. I never heard him coming, and the next thing I knew, I was pushed through the air and tumbled down into the water, crashing into the layer of algae and into the dark cold of the pond. I panicked, struggling for air, desperate to escape the murky water that I was so sure would swallow me up and leave nothing to be found. As I fought to breach the surface, I found that I was being held down, forced to hold the last bit of air that burned to escape my lungs. Every terrible fear I knew felt like a reality, waiting for me at the bottom of that pond. Finally, when I was all but sure that I would die, I found myself released. I broke the surface with a gasp, every muscle in my body screaming for air and the comfort of the shore. When I reached safety and had come to my senses, I became aware of an uproarious laughter behind me. I turned and saw what I should have expected, my stepbrother, cackling like a madman at his brilliant ambush. Of course, when I arrived home, his mother would hear nothing of my side of the story. Daniel told her that I fell in, and his best clothes were ruined trying to save me from drowning. The thrashing she gave me for my lies was one of the worst that I have ever received, and I was forbidden from ever venturing into the forest again. As I said, I never loved my stepbrother. But there was one time, and perhaps only one time, that I felt close to him, and it only took the death of his mother. It happened when we were 17 and 19 respectively. While she was walking home from the liquor store late one night, a drunk driver swerved just a few inches off the road and struck her in the side. As she fell, her head landed on a guardrail, killing her instantly. Our family is just full of little ironies. In his grief, Daniel turned to God. I, myself, was a devout agnostic, finding no fault in faith, but many in religion. At the time, I supported his newfound devotion, believing it would be a positive influence in his life. After all, I couldn't think of any religion that would condone his prior behavior. At the very least, perhaps I would earn some well-deserved apologies for a childhood of mistreatment. He found a church near home, one that I had never heard of, the Church of the Shepherd and Prior-Day Saints, and spent most of his spare time engaged in study. As he had recently moved away into a nearby apartment complex, I rarely saw him anymore, and I was happy to no longer suffer his presence. I focused on my schoolwork, and looking after my father, who had once again fallen into depression and drink after losing his second wife. My stepbrother came by every few weeks to see how we were doing, and I quickly noticed a great improvement in his character. As I had hoped, he expressed great remorse for his childhood behavior and often sought to make amends. On occasion, he would bring us small gifts or take us out to dinner, little tokens of gratitude for putting up with him for so long. However, Daniel treated any information about his church like a closely guarded secret. When pressed for details, he would casually deflect my questions, often changing the topic as quickly and politely as possible. I learned almost nothing about his congregation, and could barely ascertain the specific branch of faith they followed. In passing, he would sometimes make references to stars or shepherds, which I assumed must have been a reference to the story of the Nativity. Another time I overheard him on his phone talking to who I assume must have been his pastor, referring to the King of Kings. Another metaphor I attribute to Christianity. Still, my brother was a private man, and I assumed at first that his reluctance to talk about his church stemmed from a desire to not impose his faith upon us. A position that I, at the time, was happy for. Then, almost 6 months to the day of his mother's death, he told us that he planned to be rebaptized. Of course, my father and I approved. He wanted us present at the ceremony, which would be held the following Sunday at the lake not far from home. I found myself feeling anxious as the date approached, as I was not accustomed to the ritual and paganity of religion. The idea that dunking a man underwater could absolve him of his sins seemed like a quaint and ridiculous notion to me, but I wanted to appear supportive. After all, anything that would help my stepbrother become a better man had to be something worthwhile. And the day came, and my father and I arrived dressed in our best clothes, which, given our finances, weren't much to speak of. My father was so proud. He managed to stay sober for the ceremony, which was a small miracle unto itself. There were fewer parishioners present than I expected there to be, only about a dozen in all, not including the pastor and my stepbrother. The pastor was an older man, I estimated somewhere in his late 40s, from his balding head. He was sporting a robe that was all black, save for a small crimson emblem emblazoned near his right breast that, from a distance, appeared to be a cross, wreathed in flames. He was pale, almost sickly, and wore spectacles that looked like they were designed for some earlier century. Yet what stands out in my mind now, above all else, was his smile. A grin that stretched from ear to ear, like you'd imagine a shark would wear before feeding. Daniel approached us out of the crowd, looking as pleased as I'd ever seen him. He moved in for a hug, which I modestly returned. "I'm so happy both of you could make it," he exclaimed, making no attempt to hide his joy. "This is a big day for me, a huge day. Today everything turns around, I swear it." He paused. And then, "Brother." The words took me back a bit, and for a moment I was left speechless. In all the years I'd known him, we had never been willing to consider each other as true siblings. And this was the first time that I had heard him call me as such. I'm happy to be here, Dan. I stumbled over my words, still not ready to extend the same courtesy. Though in time, I thought, maybe one day soon, I could. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, the pastor exclaimed from the lake edge, but we do have an appointment to keep. Daniel. Excuse me, Father, my father said, a little shocked as I was by the pastor's rudeness. We just got here and we'd like a few words with... No, Dad, it's all right, Daniel said, cutting him off mid-sentence. There are rules we have to follow. It's okay. We'll be done in just a minute. He turned from us and returned to the group. Noticing them now for the first time, I saw that none were wearing clothes that one would consider appropriate for such a special occasion. In fact, all of them were wearing the same outfit. A bland black and white wool garment that would have looked more at home in an Amish community. I began to wonder if my brother had joined some kind of a cult, but followed them anyway, down to the water's edge. As my stepbrother began to wade into the lake, hand in hand with his pastor, he paused and looked back towards my father, with a look that I can only describe as concern, or perhaps even remorse, and said 3 words that will haunt me to my grave. Don't be afraid. And before I could ask what he meant, he turned back and walked out into the water. As he moved deeper, the crowd around us, without cue, began to sing a strange hymn that I had never heard before, ominous, but at the same time uplifting. The inflection in their tone was closer to a chant than a melody. It was around that time that I realized they were singing in perfect Latin, that I knew something was terribly wrong. I dare not even attempt to describe it here. Disregarding my stepbrother's warning, I felt an intense desire to flee, to run into the water and rescue Daniel from what I sure would be some kind of horrible mistake, to escape into the woods and leave this surreal scene as many miles behind us as possible. But even as this instinct grew, my feet felt rooted to the spot, my eyes transfixed on the ritual, unable to look away. While the pastor was now in the lake past his waist, Daniel was slightly taller and crouched down into the water to stand with his head just below the man's shoulders. He looked up to the pastor, his face awash with awe, as the man raised his hands above my stepbrother's head and began to speak. "We are here today to cleanse our brother Daniel of his sins," he started, "to wash his spirit clean in this holy lake, and present him to our Lord as a man of faith renewed, his soul reborn, his devotion absolute." He closed his eyes then, and with a look of utmost concentration uttered a chant in another tongue, one that I still haven't been able to place to a region or time in known history, even without knowing that meaning. I could sense a power in those words, one that no other religion could claim authority over. It lasted all of 30 seconds, but when he finished reading, I felt like I'd been trapped in them for days. And then, with a swiftness, one that I wouldn't expect from a man of his advanced age, he lowered his hands onto the scruff of my stepbrother's neck, and with his other arm submerged my brother into the lake. In preparation for this day, I had watched other baptisms on the internet, so I would know what to expect. And I knew that my brother shouldn't have been under the surface for more than half a second. A hole if the pastor wasn't quite as quick as the younger ministers. When at 6 seconds Daniel was still being held under, my father began to yell. I honestly couldn't tell you what he screamed at the pastor, but the next minute of my memory is still terribly muddled by what transpired. When I try to remember, there are small gaps, like details that I've forgotten, as if my mind is still trying to come to terms with what surely must have been impossible. What I do remember is terrible enough, and I hope that these abstractions are merely my psyche trying to cope with the reality, but this is what I recall. As my father stormed off into the lake, the choir of strangers around us ceased their singing, and aside from the sound of my father's ranting and splashing, it became unnaturally quiet, and the air became as a crypt. I remember then my father ceasing his advance, stopping mid-sentence as he became aware, as I was, that there was something utterly dark and unholy transpiring before us. It was then that the pastor looked up from where he held my brother, who had now been under for a full 20 seconds, and slowly shifted his gaze unto me. He smiled, still, but that vaguely off-putting grin was transformed. It twisted itself into an expression of simple, unmistakable malice. His eyes were black as pitch. Daniel, who by now was surely drowning, began to thrash in the water, his death throes kicking up waves that disrupted the perfect silence that he descended onto the lake. My brother was a strong man, young and healthy, and yet this old priest held him under the surface like a child, his grip unrelenting. He was dying before me, and yet my horror still held me in place, unable to move. The struggle did not end as far as I could tell, so much as it was interrupted. Originating from the spot where my brother was fighting for his life, I noticed a dark stain spreading slowly across the surface. A jet-black substance that seemed to have the consistency of ink or oil, branching into a tendril-like form that seemingly moved with purpose, defiling the water as it crept ever closer to the shore. Here's an empty spot in my memory, a moment I'm not sure I don't truly wish to remember. Where it resumes, my father is gone. And the next moment I can recall, I'm standing alone on the shore and the parish has disappeared, presumably taken wherever my father has vanished to. Or perhaps dispersed into the forest, having found the ritual satisfactory. In the water still, the pastor stands, still holding down my brother, whose last desperate struggle are dying down to a few futile thrashes, barely causing a ripple over the surface. And then with the last few bubbles of escaping air, I knew that he was gone. The pastor was still staring at me, his eyes the same shade as the stain that consumed the lake, his gaze never leaving mine, his smile never faltering. He wore a look of grim satisfaction, a knowing that his godless act has come to completion, and his eyes never leaving mine, he began to slowly descend into the depths, as if the ground had opened up beneath and swallowed him, accompanying him into the dark. It was only then, alone, by the lakeside, that I found I could move again. And I promptly fell to my knees, and I wept. The police never found my brother, my father, or any proof of the church's existence. They even had the audacity to accuse me of their murder, but I was released on lack of evidence. After all, there wouldn't be much of a case if they couldn't find any bodies to pin to me. Begrudgingly, they sent to the care of a local psychiatric hospital. While the staff here has treated me well, I hold a bitter resentment towards them. No one here believes my story. They call it the fevered delusions of a disconcerted mind. They try to drown my memories in pills and hunt for hidden meanings, but they'll find none. I'm certain, as terrible and impossible as it may be, that what I saw, what I witnessed, is beyond the grasp of a sane mind. I know it to be true. And when I lie in my bed at night, unable to sleep, I comfort myself by thinking that my brother knew what he was volunteering for. I tell myself his faith had revealed to him that there existed gods older than man, than religion, perhaps older than time itself, gods that lie just beyond our understanding, waiting for their chance to reign again. He knew that they were coming, and chose to willingly give himself up to them, to usher their return to our world. And I hear, as if he were standing beside me, his final message. Don't be afraid.
Picture this. 900,000 people are reported missing every year in the United States alone. You heard that number correctly. Don't believe me? Look it up. 900,000 people. A staggering 2,300 people are reported missing daily. Now, let's be clear. Many of these cases are solved relatively quickly, and I'm not talking about bloated corpses found floating in rivers or dismembered bodies turning up somewhere off the Jersey Turnpike. Of the 900,000 people who are reported missing annually, around 850,000 of them are kids. Most missing children tend to fall into one of the two categories: runaways who eventually return home safely, or family abductions, the latter of which occurs when either the mother or father runs off with the little ones because of a domestic dispute or divorce. As far as adults go, a large portion of missing cases typically involve people who are suffering from drug or alcohol abuse. These addicts have a tendency to go on benders, disappearing from their friends and family for days on end while they pump their bodies full of booze and illegal narcotics. A surprisingly high number of reports are concerning senior citizens suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's. You'd be surprised how often they wander away from their caretakers and get lost. Usually, it doesn't take very long for the police to locate the disoriented old-timer and bring them back to the nursing home. Given these facts, we see the number of people, both children and adults, who are abducted by strangers is actually relatively small. Only about 150 of these kinds of abductions are estimated to occur in the United States annually. Now, picture this. You are an artist, a painter, who specialized in Impressionism. You loved art all your life. You saw a coffee table book when you were 12 years old that had a picture of Blue Dancers by Edgar Degas. You couldn't look away from it. You were mesmerized by the colors, the brushstrokes, the way the girls in the painting contorted their bodies. To you, they didn't even look like dancers. They were a meadow of morning glories, swaying in a gentle breeze. You knew right then and there that you wanted to create something as gorgeous and spellbinding as that picture. You studied the greats: Renoir, Degas, Cézanne, and of course, Monet. When you turned 15, you started taking art classes after school at the local community college, but you never shared your passion with anyone, not even your closest friends and family. You were afraid of what they might say. What if they laughed at you? What if they told you that your paintings were sloppy or ugly? What if they told you that you didn't have talent, that you'd never create your own Blue Dancers one day? So you hid your passion from everyone you knew. Whenever you finished a piece, you tossed it in the garbage because seeing your art in a dumpster was better than the possibility of hearing your friends make fun of it. You wanted to study art in college, but society told you that only morons do that. Instead, you opted for an engineering degree. Your parents were happy. You graduated from school and got a job where you sat in a cubicle and made $55,000 per year. You spent all day, every day, musing about what it would be like to wake up each morning and do nothing but paint. you tried to keep up with your art. But you never had the time. Your boss asked you to work weekends every chance that he got, and when you did have a second to yourself, you were too tired to do anything but watch TV or surf the web. You started to hate yourself for being so spineless, for not pursuing the only thing in life that ever made you feel good. You fell into a depression. Picture this. An estimated 1 in 10 adults suffer from depression. That means that there are at least 31 million people in the United States who feel lost, who feel hopeless, who feel like the world would be a better place without them, and you were one of those people. You wore a mask in front of your family and friends. That part was easy. You could hide your depression too. Nobody at work could see how much you were hurting. But when you got home, you lay in bed and you cried. You thought about downing an entire bottle of aspirin, but you were afraid of what people would say if you survived. You stood on the edge of your bathtub with one end of a belt looped around your neck and the other fastened to the metal rod of your shower curtain while you weighed the pros and cons of suicide. You spent hours surfing the internet, visiting forums, looking for ways to save yourself. You even went so far as to post questions anonymously, pleading for help. Then you got the piece of advice that you believe you were searching for. From Reddit, of all places, a website famous for stupid cat pictures and bastardizing the word meme. It came in the form of a comment in a thread that you made about feeling suicidal. You didn't see the commenter's username. In fact, you were so excited after reading their advice that you closed your browser's window before checking where it came from. It didn't matter who they were in real life anyway. As far as you were concerned, those words were sent to you straight from your guardian angel, watching over from heaven. Try finding a creative outlet, your web surfing savior said. I picked up painting as a means of channeling my depression. Whenever I'm feeling down, I grab a brush and get to work. It helps to serve as a fantastic distraction. So picture this. You took the guardian angel's advice and ran with it. You swore off suicide, called your mom and dad and told them that you loved them. The very next morning, you woke up and headed to the library when you spent the entire day reading about your favorite artists, the painters that you had idolized your entire life. For hours, you looked at photos of their works and it made you feel young again. Then you stumbled upon a book with a picture of blue dancers and you found yourself awestruck, just like the time when you were 12. It was that moment you decided to quit your job and follow your dreams. Your mom and dad weren't happy, but they understood when you told them about your depression. They always thought art was just a mild hobby and had never actually seen one of your finished paintings before. It took all the courage that you could muster to show them a piece you prepared for them. After all, it was more than just a picture to you. It was your heart, your dreams. It was a piece of your soul. It went better than you expected. The painting made your dad smile and your mom tear up. Since you had no job, they let you move back in and turn your room into a studio until you could figure things out. And picture this. You turned back to the internet for advice. Only this time, you weren't looking for someone to talk you off a ledge. You wanted tips on color blending and assistance on applying primer. You started posting pictures of your work to various forums, looking for guidance, but you got more than you bargained for. You began receiving compliments. Total strangers, telling you how much they loved your art. A few people even commissioned pieces from you. You sold your first painting for $300 to a newlywed couple in Minnesota who said your art would be perfect for their new home. It was surreal. All you ever wanted to do was paint, and now people were paying you for it. You opened an online store, started a blog, and even built a website with links to all of your social media accounts. You began to rack up followers on Facebook and Twitter. A couple of your paintings were blogged around the internet thousands of times, and Art Enthusiast magazine even did a feature on one of your pieces. It wasn't on the cover or anything, but it was an honor just to get a tiny blurb. Eventually, you made enough money to move out of your parents' house and get a small apartment of your own. You certainly weren't rich, but you got to wake up and do nothing but paint every day. Just like you always dreamed. One morning, you open your eyes to see a half-finished commissioned piece staring back at you from across the room. Rays of early morning sunshine shimmered in through the window, falling on the partially completed painting. It glimmered in the daylight. You thought about how lost you would have been if not for that guardian angel on the internet who convinced you to paint your sadness away. You smiled to yourself. The first time in a long time that it wasn't forced, because you knew that you were finally happy. But picture this. When one begins to receive admirers, they also start to attract critics. Because people who question how or why you got to where you are in your career, some of them were jealous. They wanted what you had. Many of them were artists in their own right who didn't receive nearly the amount of attention that you got. You found their hate silly. After all, it's not like your paintings were touring museums around the country. You were barely scraping by, but they couldn't support themselves with their art. So they hated you. Some of your other detractors weren't artists at all. They were trolls who couldn't stand to see other people happy, so they did their best to knock you down a peg. They used the cloak of anonymity to message you through Twitter just to call you names. They told you that your work was crap. But when they said that, they weren't just insulting your paintings, they were insulting you. Remember, your art was a reflection of your heart, your dreams. It was a piece of your soul. And these sorry excuses for human beings, hiding behind idiotic user handles, were shitting all over it. And then something strange happened. You no longer heard the praise and the compliments. They were still there, but almost muffled in a way, suffocated and drowned out by a vocal minority who only wanted to see you fail. You fought to prove yourself, to paint something that would make even your most overly zealous hecklers change their minds about you. But the more of your heart you poured into your work, the harsher their words became. The closer you got to creating your very own blue dancers, the more hate and vitriol they spewed at you. It began to consume you. It was all you could think about. Picture this. Hacking isn't nearly as difficult as Hollywood would have you believe it is. You don't need to be a zit-faced computer whiz that spends 18 hours a day in a dark basement, eating Cheetos and drinking Mountain Dew, to learn how to do it. You don't even need to know how to get around firewalls or disassemble code. All you need is patience. Patience and the understanding that people, even anonymous internet trolls, get a little too comfortable and give away personal information without even thinking about it. Now picture this. The hate keeps coming for you. Every time you posted a picture of your work or announced another sale on Facebook, there they were, popping up like a rash of pus-filled herpes sores. One commenter in particular really got under your skin. His username was DarkPainter97, and every remark he made on your art blog was rude and spiteful. Overrated, he called you. Unoriginal and uninspired as well. You could see the resentment seething out of every comment he left underneath your posts. You had grown sick of his cyberbullying. Part of you wanted to see what this keyboard warrior looked like in real life, so without thinking, you clicked on his username. The link directed you to the profile page of his blog, but he didn't have any pictures uploaded to it. However, a caption on the About section caught your eye. It said, "Follow me on Twitter, @DarkPainter97. You checked out his Twitter account to see if the anonymous jackass had posted any photos of himself. He hadn't, and his profile picture was just some stupid cartoon character. But you did notice he was very active on his account. He went back and forth tweeting jokes with one particular user quite frequently, a teenager whose user handle included his real name, with a very clear face picture. They appeared to be good friends. You realized that the 97 in Dark Painter 97 was more likely a reference to the year your tormentor was born. It made sense. It takes a certain amount of immaturity and free time to cyberbully someone, and teenage boys have both of those in spades. You performed a Facebook search of his friend's name and found him pretty easily. His Facebook page had the privacy functions disabled, so it wasn't hard to poke around. The teenager only had about 125 friends on Facebook, so you began filtering through his list, looking for boys who were born in the year of 1997. It only took about an hour of sifting through profile pages until you found something that struck a chord with you. It was a boy who fit the bill. He was a smarmy little weasel who looked like he hadn't been outside a day in his life. Everything about his face irked you, from his bird beak of a nose to the pair of bulky camouflage print Oakley sunglasses he was wearing in his profile picture. You wanted so badly to smash his smug smile into paste. Then you looked at the info section of his page, and you felt the light bulb in your head slowly begin to brighten. Likes, gaming, manga, and painting. Okay, that's a check, but liking to paint doesn't automatically make him the culprit. Birthday, June 26th, 1997. Double check. And of course, follow my art blog @DarkPainter97. Checkmate, bitch. You had him. You knew what that insufferable little troll looked like, where he lived. You even knew what high school he went to. In just over an hour and a half, you had learned everything you could ever want to know about him. But what were you going to do with your newfound information? According to his Facebook, he lives a state away. That's a long way to go to tell someone off. You told yourself that driving over state lines for the sole purpose of yelling at some idiot kid was crazy. But you couldn't stop yourself. It was like someone else had taken control of your body. Before you knew it, you were on the interstate, halfway between the teenager's hometown and your apartment. You stopped off for a burger when you hit his county, and looked his parents' information up on your cell phone. Finding their home address was easy. The time was around 4 p.m., and you pulled up to his house. According to their Facebook pages, his mom and dad both worked 9 to 5, so you figured they wouldn't be home yet. You could see the little brat through the window, fiddling around on his computer, probably leaving another disparaging comment on the latest picture that you uploaded to your blog. Either that, or looking at porn. Things had worked out too perfectly for you. You had come too far not to give him a piece of your mind, so you pulled your car into the driveway and knocked on the front door. You could tell he was confused when he saw it. He had no idea who you were, which was something that you found funny. If you had spent as much time as he did harassing someone on the internet, you figured that you'd at least recognize them if they were standing at your front door. You opened your mouth to speak. You even pointed an accusatory finger at him, but his entitled little face made you so damn angry. You blacked out. When you came to your senses, you were standing over him in the foyer. Now that arrogant look on his face was gone. Instead, it appeared as if a cherry bomb had exploded in it. His nose was mushed into pulp, and his left eye was completely swollen shut. You were taken aback with yourself. How had that happened? You weren't even a violent person. In fact, you had never planned on causing the kid any sort of physical harm. You looked at the grandfather clock against the wall. It was 4:30. Where had the time gone? Who knew how long you had before the parents got home? Charges started to rattle off in your mind. Aggravated assault of a minor, burglary. Who knows? Maybe even attempted murder. If they caught you, then you'd do the next 15 years in prison, for sure. Goodbye art career. Then you had another thought. If you just ran off, the snotty little shit might be able to identify you once he came to, so you panicked. You slung his unconscious body over your shoulder and carried him outside to your car. Lady Luck must have been on your side because there was no one else in sight. You dumped him in your trunk and backed out of the driveway as fast as you could before speeding off to make your getaway. Only about 150 people get abducted by strangers in the United States annually. Now this kid was one of them. And he was locked in the back of your trunk. Picture this. 1 in every 15,000 people is murdered in the U.S. each year. Doesn't that number sound high? It's true, though. Don't believe me? Look it up. 1 in every 15,000 people. Calculate that stat over a 75-year lifespan, and that means that there is a 1 in 200 chance that someone will try and kill you. It's a terrifying thought, really. In comparison, your chances of getting hit by a car are only 1 in 600, which means you're 3 times more likely to get gutted by a knife-wielding maniac or shot by a jaded ex-lover than you are to get run over by a minivan that's driver was texting while speeding through an intersection. Now picture this. You made it back inside your apartment with the kid. It was late, so you were able to smuggle him up into your unit under the cover of darkness. To your knowledge, no one had seen you. You were safe for the moment, but you were sick to your stomach about what had just transpired. You remember the warm, fuzzy feeling you got after reading the advice of your guardian angel, and you were pretty sure the mixture of emotions that were now brewing inside you were the exact opposite. You wondered what kind of guidance that anonymous angel of the internet would give you this time. But what were you going to do? Start a thread on Reddit about it? TIFU by assaulting and kidnapping a minor. The kid was bleeding profusely from the mutilated chunk of flesh hanging off his face that used to be a nose. You placed him in your bathtub to prevent him from gushing all over the floor of your apartment while you thought about how to rectify the situation. Tears began to well up in your eyes once you realized how screwed you were. You were no criminal. You were an artist. But artists don't beat their critics to within an inch of their lives. "I'm sorry," you cried out to the kid, whose body, a broken pile of pulverized meat, lay motionless in your tub. "I never meant for this to happen." You feared he would die in your bathroom before you could muster up the courage to call him an ambulance. You knew you had made a terrible mistake and needed to own up to it. But you were so afraid to go to prison. Between your sobs, you heard a whimper. You peered up to see the kid begin to stir. The eye that wasn't swollen shut made contact with yours. His sclera was red as a dog's dick, and you could tell he was straining to focus, but he was staring right at you. The teenager's whimpers turned into something that resembled a low gurgle, almost as if he was drowning in the blood that had pooled in the back of his throat, but you realized he wasn't drowning. He was laughing, causing your concerns to give way to confusion. Yeah. He forced out a few grunts in an effort to say something, his voice whistling through the broken teeth, jagged shards of bone that you had shattered with your fist. You're that fucking shitty artist, aren't you? He groaned. His gurgling laugh began again, and you understood it was directed at you. He had won. With nothing but an internet modem and a laptop, he had successfully derailed your career, and he knew it too. You were going to spend the rest of your life in prison with that thought of fiery rage swelled inside of your chest. You didn't deserve what the little shit had done to you. All you wanted to do was make art, to paint your own blue dancers, and this entitled piece of trash had taken it away from you. There was no blacking out the second time. You were fully aware of what you were doing when you mounted his body and began to pummel his face. With each blow, you could feel his cheekbones collapse more and more underneath your knuckles. You clawed at his eyes like a rabies-stricken animal that forced your hands inside of his mouth and pulled at his jaw, popping it from his hinges. And when your arms got sore, you stood up and let your boots take a turn to the kid's cranium. Picture this. It takes 200 pounds of pressure to crush a human skull. By the time you had finished wailing away on the teenager, his head looked like a plate of pink and purple mashed potatoes. 1 in every 15,000 people in the United States is murdered every year, and now this kid, whose brains were currently spilling down your bathtub's drain, was the newest casualty of that statistic. You washed his blood off your hands in the sink and tried to calm down a little. After looking back at the headless corpse in your tub, you realized you were a little frightened with yourself. But it wasn't because you had just murdered a teenager in cold blood. It was the sensation of ecstasy washing over your body that worried you. It felt amazing. Like you had just lived out a fantasy, not a sexual one. Stomping the kid's skull in didn't get you off, but it was more than a little empowering. The snotty little turd deserved everything that he got, but now you had a new problem on your hands. It didn't take a criminal mastermind to know that keeping the kid's body in your tub was a bad idea. But getting rid of it wasn't as simple as chucking it down the trash chute. You were an artist, though. And artists have creative minds. So you did what creative minds do. You got creative. Picture this. On average, 75 people are arrested in the United States for having sex with the deceased every year. Don't believe me? Look it up. 75 people. This is especially concerning considering there are 4 states, Louisiana, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and North Carolina, where necrophilia isn't even against the law. Of the 75 people arrested for making love to the dead annually, nearly half of them work in mortuaries. Given these facts, one can assume that the funeral homes are a magnet for necrophiliacs. It makes sense when you think about it after all. It seems like the dream job for someone who indulges in that kind of fetish. Many psychologists believe that only a small fraction of these people actually have sexual attractions to dead bodies. Most engage in necrophilia due to social anxieties. It's the fear of rejection or the body's inability to perform under pressure that causes people to stray down this path. Corpses can't laugh at the size of your penis, or roll their eyes if you can't get it up, so people find comfort and safety in the dead. It is for that reason that a staggering 94% of necrophiliacs are men. Just like any sexual fetish, necrophilia has its own dark little community on the internet If one looks hard enough, they'll be able to find forums where users anonymously trade pictures and tell stories of their latest sexual conquests. Well, I say anonymously, but as I explained before, when it comes down to the internet, people have a tendency to get a little too comfortable and give away their personal information without even thinking about it. So picture this. You opened up your laptop and did a little digging. Google is magic. Within minutes, you were perusing a forum full of cadaver-loving freaks. An hour or two browsing, and you were stumbling upon a thread that sparked your interest. In an off-topic throwaway comment, one of the perverts claimed to regularly visit a pizza joint not more than 5 minutes from your apartment before engaging in his morbid sexcapades. After scanning his comment history, you saw that he often bragged about how his job supplied him with an endless stream of what he called his real love dolls. It turned out he was a mortician who really enjoyed the alone time he spent with the corpses that he was supposed to be beautifying. You created an account and messaged him, claiming to be a 19-year-old girl who was really into watching guys screw stiffs. When he asked for verification, you scrounged up some pictures of your friend's little sister and sent them to him. People are gullible when they want to believe something, and this guy really wanted to believe that a cute co-ed was interested in perverts who fuck dead bodies. He sent you a face pic. When you performed a reverse image search, it directed you right to his Facebook page. The idiot had messaged you his profile picture. His Facebook page did indeed confirm that he was a mortician, and even listed the names of the funeral home that he worked at. You smiled to yourself when, after looking the place up, you read that it had a crematorium. However, there was something else you found out about him after digging through his information. Something you found very useful. The pervert had a family too. A wife, and an 11-year-old son. You sweet-talked the mortician through the night, encouraging him to tell you about the disgusting things that he does to newly arrived cadavers. He said that he wanted to fuck you on top of them. It turns out that he was one of the few necrophiliacs that didn't have a fear of performing. This sicko was just genuinely attracted to dead bodies. You told him all the nasty things he knew he wanted to hear. When you asked for a dick pic, he was more than happy to oblige. The picture he sent you was a full-body nude with his erect cock and face clearly visible in the frame. The two of you made plans to meet up at the mortuary after hours for a little ménage à trois with a 24-year-old model who had recently died from a coke overdose. For some reason, he always seemed really excited to tell you how his real love dolls had passed. You assumed it was all part of his fetish. You showed up at the funeral home the following evening with a manila folder full of hard evidence. He broke down and started crying when you explained to him that he'd been duped. You presented him with photos that he sent you and explained to him that you had screenshots of the previous night's conversation saved and backed up. The mortician begged you not to show his wife. Apparently, she had caught him on top of a girl who had perished in a car wreck. His wife was pregnant at the time and only stayed with the mortician for the baby's sake, but she had informed him that if she found out that he was ever doing it again, she'd call the cops and take his son away from him forever. He tried to make you go away by writing you a check, but you refused the bribe. You hadn't come for money. You explained that you needed him to help you make a body disappear. The plan was simple. The funeral home had a crematorium, and all you needed was access to it. The mortician reluctantly agreed to help you in exchange for keeping his revolting secret under wraps, so the two of you headed to your car and hoisted an oversized duffel bag containing Dark Painter 97's body out of your trunk. You carried it inside, but when you asked the mortician to direct you to the crematorium, he waved his hands. "I've got it from here," he told you. You shot him a suspicious look and informed him that if he was planning on going to the police, your evidence would be in his wife's inbox the next day. Don't worry, he said. You're safe. The kid will be ashes by the end of the night. He asked you how the teenager died, so you told his story. Well, I get murders from time to time, but that sounded especially brutal, he responded after hearing your grisly tale. When you finished, you thanked him for his help. He started out the door. No. Thank you, he said. His remark left you puzzled. It wasn't until after you started your car and pulled out of the parking lot that you realized what the mortician was showing his appreciation for. You had delivered him a new play toy, a real love doll. And he was going to have some fun with it before he sent it off to the incinerator. Picture this. Roughly 85% of the country's population had access to the internet. That means approximately 270 million people in the United States alone are connected to the World Wide Web. Of that 270 million, a little over half have profiles on active social networking sites, which makes the number of people using Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Tinder, and all other flavors of the week tally somewhere around 135 million. You were one of the 135 million. So what did you do after having just gotten away with murder? You hopped on your social media to help yourself forget about the past couple of days. The problem was, the image of Dark Painter 97's caved-in skull kept flashing through your mind. Even worse, you can't help but picture what that perverted mortician was most likely doing to the partially headless cadaver that you had brought him. Your thoughts turned back to your guardian angel. You hadn't logged back into your Reddit account since that hero of the internet had rescued you from your depression. It wasn't necessary. Up until a few hours ago, you had believed yourself to be relatively happy. But the day had been a traumatic one, so you decided to check in on the cyberspace Superman to see if he was still crusading around, searching for lost souls to save. It took a minute for you to remember your password, but once you had logged in, you navigated the site to find that old suicide thread that you had made. It stung you more than you thought that it would to reread the post. It reminded you how black the world seemed back then. You scrolled down the thread looking for your guardian angel, the one person on the planet who seemed to understand you. The comment was still there, and you began to read it, hoping that you would again be able to pull something useful from the sage of advice that had once saved your life, but you stopped halfway through. You had seen something that made your heart rise in your throat because, for the very first time, you read your guardian angel's username. Dark Painter 97. You rubbed your eyes and looked again just to make sure you weren't hallucinating, but the text on your monitor hadn't changed. You came to a realization that made you physically ill. Apparently 135 million Americans are active on social media sites, and you murdered the only one that had given you a reason to wake up in the morning. It was utterly ridiculous. How could a human being be so sympathetic and understanding one day and such an obnoxious little twat the next? It was like a bad dream. You felt as if a war for your sanity was being waged inside of your head. Part of you wanted to laugh at the irony of the situation. Another part of you wanted to cry. You ended up spending the entire evening staring at an unfinished piece, leaning up against the wall of your apartment, not even able to remember whom you were even painting it for. Did it matter? It was like the whole damn world had lied to you. It wasn't until morning that reality started to sink in. Perhaps the sun helped to burn off the fog that had been shrouding your brain since your revelation. But for whatever reason, you no longer felt helpless. You realized that all this time you had been using your guardian angel as a crutch, leaning on their words of wisdom whenever you felt like you couldn't stand on your own. Unfortunately, it turned out you had been worshipping a false idol. In reality, your champion had been a chimp all along, just another jealous wannabe who only cared about seeing you fall. The sick part was, you knew Dark Painter 97 was just the tip of the iceberg. You had other critics, worse ones, and they deserved everything they got, maybe even more. That strange feeling of ecstasy had once again returned, only this time it didn't make you feel frightened, it made you feel unstoppable. Picture this. Every avalanche starts with a single snowflake. Contemplate that for a second. It's a crazy thought, but it's absolutely true. The fact that a force so deadly and dangerous can come from something so innocent and harmless is remarkable. When you first started snooping around that annoying internet troll's Twitter account, you couldn't have had any idea what it would lead to. There was no way to predict that mere hours later you would be passing off his headless corpse to a mortician with a fetish for the dead. There was also no way to anticipate the other murders that it would lead to. But after discovering that you had killed your guardian angel, you felt like there was no point in simply ignoring the rest of your critics. So, you sought them out and made them pay for every hurtful comment they had ever messaged you. You started with those who only lived a day's drive away. Like a predator hunting his prey, you stalked them, lay in wait for the perfect time to strike. Their deaths were usually agonizing. You made sure that each and every one of your victims suffered painfully. The mortician was in your back pocket. You still had the ability to blackmail him. He feigned frustration with his predicament, but both of you knew he was happy with the arrangement. After about the third or fourth love doll you brought him, he began making requests. "I'd appreciate it if the next one you brought me in didn't have teeth," he would say to you. "Could you get me someone who maybe has a genetic birth defect?" You entertained his bizarre fetish. After all, it didn't matter to you what happened to the bodies that you were bringing in as long as they were a pile of ashes in the morning. The mortician had a network of people like him, hardcore cadaver humpers across the country. Many of them also worked in funeral homes and had access to their own crematoriums. Things probably started to snowball out of control when you found yourself going on vacation just to off another critic. Painting had become secondary to you. It no longer thrilled you the way that murder did. You only kept doing it and posting photos to the internet as a means to find more people to kill. You no longer strove for perfection in your art. Blue dancers had drifted further away than ever. You started to purposefully make mistakes in order to attract more negative opinions. After a while, you didn't even care if the people that you were hunting were offering genuine constructive criticisms or not. No one was safe. But even an avalanche finally reaches the bottom of the mountain. One day, a detective showed up at your apartment and started asking questions. He was trying to connect the disappearance of 2 of the people you had killed. You could tell by the look in his eyes that he didn't consider you a suspect yet. But you knew that he was smart. It would only be a matter of time before he put the pieces of the puzzle together and realized what you had done. So picture this. You packed up your belongings, emptied your bank account, and left town that night. You didn't want to rot in prison, so you moved to the other side of the country and changed your name. With a haircut and a pair of colored contact lenses you always wanted, hazel eyes, you started a new life for yourself. In a few days, you would read about yourself in the news, an up-and-coming painter who suddenly disappeared without a trace. 900,000 people are reported missing every year, and now you were one of them. A few days after that, you were the main suspect in the deaths of 2 people that detective had questioned you about. The cops were never going to find you, though. You were too smart for them. But that wasn't a problem. People still needed to die. Laying low for the rest of your life just wasn't an option. But you knew the police would be looking for a painter, so you picked up a new type of art. One that was sure to attract its fair share of critics. Writing. Given your actual motives, you figured horror was an appropriate genre to publish in. You created a new social media account under a fake name. You even used photos of a guy you went to high school with, who had died in a motorcycle accident for your profile pics. People seemed to enjoy the stories you posted on the internet, and after a while, you began to get popular. Your tales were read on forums, translated in other languages. Some of them even received hundreds of thousands of views when narrated on YouTube. Now that your work had become well known, you began to do little things that you knew would encourage criticism. You used run-on sentences and purposefully made small grammatical errors in hopes that someone would try to correct you from time to time. You even wrote stories in a second-person narrative, knowing full well just how polarizing it can be for readers. You stayed connected to the mortician and his network of perverted funeral workers. Your trap had been set, and now all you had to do was lay in wait for critics to come along who didn't resist tearing your work to pieces. And along they came, like a moth to a light bulb. People were drawn to the flaws that you had engineered into your writing. They pointed them out under the cover of anonymity. But the masks they wore were as flimsy as papier-mâché. There is no privacy anymore. No way to truly remain faceless. If someone wants to dig hard enough, they can learn as much about you as your closest and dearest friends. So let me ask you a question. One that I'm sure a lot of you will laugh off once you realize whom the story is about. But one that you'd be wise to take very, very seriously next time you post to the internet. Are you picturing it yet?
About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the U.S. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. And to pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night. Never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police patrol park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic, almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment, when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say that he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and was wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild. His head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky, and his mouth formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing, and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move, and once I had put about a half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing, to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street, and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain that he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast, and I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him. And then he started moving towards me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point that I ran away, or pulled out my pepper spray, or my cell phone, or anything at all. But I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What the fuck do you want?" What came out was a whimper. Oh, what the Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid, but he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go, until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore. Nor was he dancing. I watched, in horror, as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic, and looking behind me. Then, He was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see.
Does anyone know a good plumber? I fucked up one of those stupid ritual things that everyone's doing, and now my shower's leaking. And also there's some faceless guy in my kitchen. My landlord comes tomorrow, and he's going to kill me. Especially because I also have a cat, I'm not even supposed to have pets. It all started when I was drunk messaging a girl on Tinder, and she said the only way that we would be able to meet up is if I did this weird ritual thing where I summon a ghost or some shit. And I think she called it mea culpa or something. Actually, her exact message was, "The decaying flesh will not rest. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I have seen the burning cities consume the earth." Link to ritual instructions. "Our souls meet when darkness spills mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa." She was a weird chick. At least I think she was a girl. I couldn't really see her face. Her picture was just a black background with 2 shiny dots that kind of looked like eyeballs. You could sort of see some features, but it looked like her face was gray and I couldn't really see her mouth, but she had really good skin. I wasn't about to rally for a pizza face. So, anyway, I weighed the pros and cons of spooky rituals versus trampoline booty as best I could on 5 shots of Patron. It was totally worth it. I set my cell phone to 3:26 a.m., but since my phone is a 2005 Motorola Razr, it was dropped at the toilet several times, it went off at 4 a.m. Fuck. I was also supposed to have a friend during this thing, but my bestie recently got incarcerated for selling heroin on the corner of Patterson Park and Eastern Avenue. Shout out to my main man. Anyway, I set up and turned off my alarm, but the moment I turned it off, I suddenly drunkenly passed out again. I woke up 20 minutes later and actually got out of bed this time, stumbling across the room in the dark, because apparently you're not supposed to turn on the lights, because if you do, a ghost will pop out. Ooh. I was supposed to find a candle and light it, but my hangover just made me trip over the several candles I placed on the floor. Eventually I gave up, flipped on the light switch, grabbed the candle from my desk, squinted out my window to see what my ghetto Baltimore neighborhood looked like at 4:20 a.m. The streets were empty except for some rando wearing a black robe and giant pointy black hat. He was staring up at me through the window. I couldn't really see his face, you know. Baltimore's gone to the fucking dogs. First gang wars, now an updated KKK. For God's sake. Well, I lit the candle and looked at my phone. I was supposed to knock on my bedroom door 66 times. The 66th knock timed on the 4:06, but since I had fucked everything else up, I just did a shave and a haircut knock, and then walked to the hallway. My bedroom door is opposite the stairs, and looking down that dark stairwell was pretty spooky. I thought I saw something move on one of the lower steps. For the next step, I was supposed to close my eyes and walk forward while chanting mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa, which is Italian for my culpa, which is probably some kind of shitty Italian car. I tried to close my eyes and walk forward while talking about Italian cars, but my cat, Fish Sticks, ran under my feet. I ended up tripping over him and falling down the flight of stairs. At some point, the stupid candle went out as I flailed down the stairs, but I was too concussed to care. I rolled up from the ground, groaned, and decided that I would just continue to go through the motions. which meant hiding in the closet, waiting for the ghost to play hide and seek with me. And I chose the kitchen pantry because I had some open potato chips in there. So I made my way back, and as I stumbled, I heard several soft whispers behind me. I spun around, hoping that I was right about fish sticks knowing how to talk, but there was no one there, except for the figure standing in the corner. I stopped, blinked, and it was gone. I really needed to lay off the Patron. As I honed in on the closet, the alcohol and concussion finally caught up to me, and I stumbled to a stop, doubling over and vomiting watery Patron all over my kitchen floor. Fuck! My ass was landlord grass, and the hellish combination of alcohol, concussion, post-vomit, and a looming eviction notice caused my emotions to go haywire, and I unleashed a violent sob, mucus and tears rivering down my face. I heard a noise outside the kitchen. My eyes fell on the kitchen window, and I spied that stupid gang member KKK dude in my backyard, still staring at me. I must have looked like an idiot weeping in front of my kitchen pantry, too ashamed to confront him. I just crawled into the pantry and shut the door. It was so cold in there. Damn froze my man tits off. My air conditioner was probably broken. I definitely needed to call the landlord, but that would mean sedating fish sticks and stuffing him in a suitcase under my bed. And at this point, I realized that I needed to reevaluate my life. Maybe I shouldn't drink as much. Maybe I should give fish sticks to a good home. Maybe I should find women with intellect and poise. Maybe I should move out of my shit neighborhood with the KKK people roaming around at 4 a.m. After going through an entire existential crisis in my pantry, I decided to say fuck it and end the entire stupid ritual. That Tinder girl wasn't even that hot anyway. And besides, I still had like 70 more ritual things to complete, which include lighting 8 more candles, stabbing a Japanese doll, and spinning around in a circle while screaming, "You're it, you're it, you're it." And this is all supposed to culminate in me going to my basement, sitting in front of a mirror and looking into the mirror, but not actually looking into it, which made absolutely no fucking sense. As I got up to open the pantry door, I heard a low moan coming from behind the door. And I froze. I prayed to God it wasn't my landlord. I cracked open the door to see the gang member, the KKK, standing in the kitchen staring at me, and I finally got a good look at him. He definitely didn't have a face. I guess getting your face taken away is part of a gang ritual now. But he didn't react to my presence, he just stared. I didn't even know how the hell to deal with the gang members or faceless KKK members, so I just stared back. He did this for about 5 minutes before I slowly inched out of the kitchen and back upstairs. He turned to watch me as I went, but didn't move. So, after that, I went up to the bathroom to take a shower, and now my shower head is leaking, which I blame on the stupid ritual. So if you guys know any good plumbers in the Baltimore area, I would really, really appreciate it. Have you ever heard of the musical The Puppets Regime? Most likely you haven't. I mean, in fact, even some hardcore musical lovers often don't know the story of this little production. It was a 1934 stage musical written by anonymous authors of music, lyrics, and book. It starred upcoming performers such as Timmy Cutie Pie Wright, Sally Wilkes, Henry Gregory, as well as many others. At the time, it was the most expensive show to that date. It was said to be the biggest, most spectacular show you'd ever see. I've actually compiled a couple different research articles, just from the Testament of Tyler Warwick, 1901 to 1983. I went to see the show when I was about a week after I turned about 33. The ticket was a gift from my sister, who knew how much I loved musicals. I remember the signs. They were huge. I also remember the playbill. It was just a single red dot with a doll-like face on it. Didn't make much sense to me, but it didn't matter, because I was going to see a Broadway show. From the Testament of Georgina Long. The cast was made completely of new people, kids and adults.
who were longing to get back on the stage after vaudeville stopped being popular. It was quite charming, really. I do remember how odd the whole thing was. All the playwrights and lyricists, and everyone, were all unnamed in that playbill. It was like a red drop, with a peculiar little face on it. Not even a title, just the little red dot. I had come to New York with my parents to cheer the family up after my grandmother had died. A Broadway musical seemed to be just what they needed. From the Testament of Carl Hannigan, I remember the first act. Then again, who could forget? The story was a little hard to follow at first. There was a little boy who lived in a puppet shop. Or maybe he lived down the street. No, he lived in a puppet shop. But he was homeless, so they provided him a home there. And the kid's name was Mortem, something weird. Oh yeah, it was Moriatum. No, Moriator. Yeah, Moriator. Anyway, Moriator's employer, the old man named Mr. Obisker. I remember his name because he was so creepy. I think his character was a pedophile. The two of them sang this weird song about puppets. It wasn't a normal song, or at least the music was normal. And the lyrics were very exciting. Music did this odd thing where the high notes and low notes sort of mixed with each other. It really set the strange mood, but we thought nothing of it. The show progressed. Testament, Gabriel Johnston. This little kid, Moriator, something like that, had a girlfriend named Trahant, and this other boyfriend named Adelbit. And together, they talked about how much they loved puppets, and so they sang this cute little song about joining forces to raise money so they could afford to buy their own puppet. And then something really odd happened in the story. The three all headed for school, and they had really nasty teachers named Madame Raperio, or something like that. And they had a reprise to the song from before she overheard them. At first, her remarks about the children's fantasies were somewhat comical, and then the light fixed on her, and she sang this heartbreaking little song about... Well, that was up for interpretation. It was somewhat about love. But it had these strange puppet metaphors. Then she went on this little breakdown. We thought that it was a strange character trait. She started singing off key, went to beat one of the children, and the curtain fell. There was a scuffle heard on stage, and we sort of dismissed it, though. So soon the curtain rose again, and we were back at the puppet shop. From the Testament of Lewis Roberts, 1905 to 1967. Moriator and his friends went to town and sang a song about selling dolls, I think it was, because the little girl had made dolls in her spare time, and she had to sell them. I remember those strange background characters. The company was so absolutely monotonous. They all wore some dark clothing, and each of them were very, very tall. I can remember how they all had their faces covered up by their hair or hats or veils. None of them spoke. None of them even sang during the course of the show. They just walked in perfect straight lines, as if they weren't even part of the show. Anyway, this strange song about buying dolls, it had absolutely no life. But for some strange reason, these kids were putting their all into it. I mean, I could see the pain on their faces as they hit those high notes. Something else. As the lyrics went on, they seemed to get a little... It's hard to explain. They all looked like they were dying a little on the inside. They looked so pale and nervous all of a sudden. Honestly, it made me a bit anxious. From the Testament of Carrie Laurie. The kids all got their money from the strange man in a cloak who sang a simple little tune, and I still remember the lyrics. Despite the fall of rain, little kitties, everyone needs a little song. Wooden dolls give you pain, little kitties. Go on, little kitties. Run along. His character was never really explained, but I remember how truly gripped the melody was. So haunting. It got you right there in the gut. Even the little kid actors seemed a bit unsettled by the new tune of the show. They all kept stuttering over their lines. They spoke and sang, and I still remember when a light bulb over the stage went out. Everyone kind of gasped, and one man, I think, even laughed. It really spooked the little girls. Little Miss what's her name? And all the names were so odd. All I know is the light bulb had gone out, and the actors were stumbling across the stage, and the whole thing looked like a terrible flop. From the Testament of Marcus Edgar, 1918-1968. So after the light bulb went out, the whole set started falling apart. We, the audience, tried our best to ignore it. We found it near impossible. The set pieces for the puppet shop screeched its way onto the stage. We could see it in the far back of the paper sky background falling down, and the light went dim in what we assumed was an attempt to hide the malfunctioning set pieces, and the kids, with the help of an oddly monotonous Mr. Obiscar, constructed the puppet. And, this weird song played. To this day, I don't know what they were saying. It sounded somewhat like Latin, but I went on to study Latin in college the next year and found it to be no way the language. I remember how it enchanted me, though. It enchanted all of us. We all began to feel this thing course through us. I remember a few people around us who were all humming in an attempt to rid themselves of the sound, and I could hear people in the front rows crying out in what sounded like pain. The actors themselves sounded as though they were all about to pass out at any moment. They were doing this odd sort of ballet. They were tripping all over themselves, and I could remember a few more lights flashing, breaking. We all sat, waited for the song to end, when I'm sorry. I can't. From the Testament of George Frank. The lights were going on and off at random, and we were all praying the damn song would end soon. And it had this force going with it. It was sucking us in. We could feel it. The little kids and Puppet Man were dancing all around when you see... From the Testament of Carolyn Mark, the lights were completely out of control. It was a mess, and that song, it was awful. But something about it, it was powerful. It had force. I watched intently as the dancers began to skip around, and I thought they were the lights. The actual events of the final scene of Act 1 of the Puppet Master's regime has been up for debate for many years, and not many people are willing to speak out about what happened on stage during those final scenes. Many believe that there is no actual record of an interview with somebody who's willing to tell the story. But that's not true. There's one testament survives, from Billy Prescott, who was only 6 at the time of the show. At such a young age, one might assume he was unaffected by what he recalls happening. I don't remember a lot because I was just a kid. All I can remember is that song. It was giving me a headache. I turned to my father to ask him if I could leave, when suddenly I saw the stage illuminate with this red light. The music stopped as one instrument after another died out, and I swear I heard pounding underneath the stage. Everyone was questioning what was happening, even the actors. I remember that teacher lady being pushed through the door to the shop, and some assembly members ran on stage for some reason and just stopped. I remember a few people started crying right there on the stage. When suddenly this curtain came forward. It's hard to describe what it looked like. It was a clear plastic wall. It came down from above. Several years later, I saw Carrie the musical on Broadway during one of its few runs. That thing that came down on the prom goers when Carrie was using laser lights to kill everyone. It was just like that. A bunch of set pieces from the earlier scenes came down on the stage, trapping all the actors in the center, and then chaos erupted. The actors were pounding on the plastic wall thing when suddenly the curtain flew out and left us all in the dark, and the audience at the time thought that it was just a really twisted ending to a terrible musical, and we were all about to get up when suddenly the curtain opened up again, revealing a single light. And in it was the little boy, Moriator. He had clawed his way through the plastic wall. We could see this blood on his hands, but I remember how he looked. There was this strings attached to every part of his body, like a puppet. Not only that, but we could see his stomach, a lack of anything. It was like somebody had put a huge ice cream scoop in his belly, and he was sobbing all over the stage, and everyone looked at him, not knowing what to do, and then he spoke. Help me. Please. Help me. Was all I could make out, and then he vomited and suddenly collapsed. And the lights all came down, and we saw the cast. They were all dead. Every one of them looked exactly like the little boy. Every one had those strings attached, and we watched as all of them, even the little boy, as their strings were pulled on. Their lifeless bodies rose on cue. And they bowed. However, we cannot be certain that this is a credible account, but unfortunately it's all we have to work with. The Puppet Master's regime sparked horrible debate among the theater companies. Several audience members had to be treated to special therapy for years to come, and the show itself was covered up by the police. For several years to come, the theater company, as well as the police department, that never managed to solve the gruesome murders of the cast of the show, denied that the play ever existed. However, in recent years, stories resurfaced, sparking much new debate on the subject. The theater that housed the show still refuses to acknowledge the show's existence, and most theater historians know nothing about the show in general. To this day, the identities of the anonymous lyrics and music writers are unknown, and all copies of the recordings of the songs and police reports have been destroyed. However, through ancient illegal copies of interviews, theater records, we can gather a bit of information on the show. The show itself had its first workshop in London during 1928. One of the show's songs, Get a Puppet, was recorded with vocals by 12-year-old Garris Creeley. However, this recording has been lost and is only available in the black market of the internet. And other than that, no official records that we know of were ever made. Some ancient accounts say that an illegal taping of the final scene of Act 1 was recorded from backstage. But we can't be certain that this is anything but a rumor. As for any official memorabilia, very little of anything was ever made for the show to be remembered by. Oddly enough, the show was never advertised, yet it somehow was well known enough to have booked tickets for several months to come. Playbills from its premiere night were given out. Most audience members destroyed their copies after seeing the show, but legend has it around 10 or 12 survived. On another note, over the years, the show has grown a small cult fan base. And here recently, an off-Broadway revival has been scheduled to premiere soon.
When I last broached the topic of the 1934 musical The Puppets Regime, my knowledge was apparently very limited. I had originally believed that all of the audience members who entered the theater on that fateful night were deceased. But I was incorrect. One lone audience member, Alice Corey James, who was 9 years old when her grandparents took her to see the show, lives in Connecticut with her grandchildren. I garnered this information after my long investigation as to the theater which housed the unfortunate events of 1934. I found myself on a wild goose chase after a long time of theater owners shoving me in different directions via emails or the rare private meeting. I was eventually given the home address of the little old man who shall go unnamed. This man had worked in several theaters over the past 50 or so years and had collected many borrowed theater items. One of these items was a box labeled 34 Creeley Wright. Now, the gentleman claimed that he'd found it in the vaults of the August Wilson Theater, but I'm not sure if he can be trusted, as his eggs seem to be in quite a few baskets, if you understand me. The oddly numbered box contained several sloppily organized papers, all of which detailed the long-awaited production of The Puppet Master's Regime. The most interesting of these files was a bulky folder that detailed the 1928 workshop in London, where the title of the show was originally Morator's Friends, which was later changed to Morator's Puppet. As music was refined, however, the title became The Puppet Dressed in Black, and finally changed to Puppet Master, which was the title they used during the actual stage readings. The folder also contained a partial script for the show, although many pages appeared to be missing. None of the song lyrics were shown on the script, although the song titles were printed in their place, along with notes from the young actor playing the part of Morator. Most of the notes were from the director, a man named Richard Weber, but one particular note seemed a bit ominous. A little less vibrato in this one, Garrus. Make me proud. Make us both proud. Mr. Sheridan. Now, this Mr. Sheridan never showed up on any other files. He may have been an unaccredited assistant director, but something along his handwriting didn't sit right with me. Anyhow, some of the song titles are rather fascinating. Tunes with such titles as Never Mind Me, Mister, or Morator Was an Orphan, and Get a Puppet make the production seem like any other. And the characters don't seem to be written in any strange way, most to my disappointment. It seems like a harmless little kiddie show, cutesy and upbeat. However, as the script progresses, the notes from Mr. Sheridan become more evident, and his messages become increasingly disturbing. We love it the way you used to do it. Stop doing what we never told you to try. Your cheeks puffed out at the end of this number, Garrus. I love it. He loves it. We both love it. They love it. Meet me backstage after the reading, Garrus. He has a gift for you. Meet us backstage, Garrus. They love to look at you. Never leave, Garrus. You're too important to Puppet Master. After reading up to the scene where Marauder and his friends try to sell dolls, creatively titled The Doll Selling Song, I decided to stop reading and do a bit of research on Garrus Creeley. I wasn't prepared for the sickening results. Garrus Creeley was born on November 3rd, 1916. His mother had been a vaudeville stripteaser who lacked the funds necessary to support a child. As a result, he was taken in as a 3-year-old by a man whose last name was Sheridan. His first name is recorded differently in many documents, and most people believe that it was either Carmichael or Charles, but Sheridan was apparently a Coney Island architect who designed elaborate fun houses and carnival houses. He was also a private composer. He had written many vaudeville numbers and Coney Island themes, and Garrus Creeley Sheridan was a semi-popular vaudeville performer in 1921 to 1923, upon which he was removed from the Sheridan home after Garrus claimed to have been sexually abused by his adoptive father. Garrus was taken to live with Annabelle and Henry McGregor, a middle-class family living in Upper Manhattan. Annabelle and Henry, in an attempt to rid him of his childhood trauma, relocated to Worcester, England, with Henry McGregor's relatives. Coincidentally, Puppet Master began rehearsals for the workshop a year after Garrus Creeley moved to England. The music and lyrics were still accredited with Anonymous. Now, one might assume that this is just another depressing backstory to a child performer from early 1900s, but it gets worse. Sheridan, along with being an architect and composer, was also a great patron of child pornography. He was the leader of a small group of individuals who specialized in the production of such articles. What makes this more revolting is that from 1921 to 1923, the years that Creeley was his legal son, Sheridan housed a child-centered burlesque theater / brothel underneath his estate. In 1924, he was placed in Danvers State Lunatic Asylum in Massachusetts and escaped in 1926, a year before rehearsal began for The Puppet Master. Now returning to the script for Puppet Master, we actually have a tangible record for both the end of Act 1 as well as most of Act 2. The actual ending of Act 1, as it was written, was such. Marauder and his friends design a puppet exactly like the one that Marauder had seen in his dreams, that was explained in a song entitled The Puppet Dressed in Black, which I assumed was cut in the Broadway production. Now this puppet then comes to life and calls upon his magic powers to send Marauder and his friends into a parallel universe. Act 2 begins with Marauder finding his friends, as well as Mr. Officer, to be asleep and dangling from puppet strings. And the musical takes a more operatic theme, as we have 6 songs that are played one after the other without a single interval of speech. The song titles beginning, "Never mind me, mister," reprise, "I can hear them sing. What is this place?" Marauder's soliloquy, "Wooden dolls," and "The wind and the whisperings." After this, Marauder is confronted by the old man in black from the first act, who, in a long monologue, explains Marauder's deep, passionate, sexual longings. Marauder realizes his clandestine emotions in a song entitled "Beautiful Music," in which the man and Marauder apparently fall spontaneously in love. And right before they allude to the thought of intercourse, the puppet dressed in black appears. Jealous of Marauder's affections, Marauder strips naked in front of the puppet, allowing for the wooden demon to seduce him. Marauder offers his soul in return for the puppet, releasing the ones closest to him. And when the children and Mr. Obscure are returned, the puppet dressed in black and the old man reveal their sole motivations: to punish the little children who repress the nature of their sexual responsibilities. And they explain this in what would eventually become the show's title song, "The Puppet Master's Regime." Then, in a spout of randomness, the puppet's face turns bright red and he shoves Marauder into a bed shaped like a hand. In the epilogue, we see that Marauder's friends have all been returned to the puppet shop. but none of them remember anything about him. As you would assume, the workshop didn't do well at all, and anybody with half a brain can understand why a musical about why children are obligated to have sex with adults and the puppets wouldn't work now, let alone in 1928. It was met with such a terrible response that the authorities forced the workshop to shut down, classifying it as a child sex tourism. Garrus Creeley was temporarily removed from the McGregor household for their approval for allowing him to participate in the production, when in reality the cast members were contradictorily obligated to never speak about the show to anyone outside the production. A week after Garrus returned to the McGregors, he was kidnapped from his bedroom, and this all happened the day before his birthday. After 2 days, the authorities found Garrus at the theater that had been holding the workshops. He was found in the basement of the theater, tied to a bed, with Sheridan. Sheridan, of course, was taken into police custody, where he died 2 days later of a lung infection. However, the most disturbing part about the crime scene was described by Officer James Cartwright. We broke through the door, and we all fumbled down the stairs. We could hear him, Creeley, screaming, and we charged into the bedroom and saw puppets. Puppets everywhere, all of them made to look exactly like the little Creeley fellow. They all had been... There had to be dozens of them all over the room. Some of them were neatly dressed like little dolls. Others didn't have any clothes on at all. It was so disgusting. I felt sick just thinking about it. Along with the recorded 76 Garrus Creeley-esque puppets that had been found underneath the theater, authorities found several articles of the occult in Sheridan's makeshift apartment. He had apparently begun to worship an ancient god called Padominus, a dark spirit who controlled all of life within invisible puppet strings. And most of the investigators believe that Sheridan had created this god himself, using the surplus of insanity that he had retained by the time of his death. They found a 5,026-page novel that Sheridan had written over the course of the past 9 years entitled Puppets. It was an extended manuscript version of Puppet Master. It was centered around the character of Marauder Absence, a character obviously based around Garrus Creeley. Following the events of the Puppet Master, the McGregors admitted Garrus Creeley to the West Riding Mental Hospital, known as Hyroids Hospital, in order to repair his obvious mental damage. He was supervised by his adoptive uncle, Dr. Gregory McGregor, who was personally documented in his progression of 1928 to 1932, when he was released. Other than the folder containing the information from the 1928 workshop, most of the documents presented in the box 34 Creeley Write were mass jumbles of different documents, everything from vague police reports to scratching reviews of the workshop, and none of them are in any particular order. The only valuable document I've managed to find is a list containing the names of all the audience members who attended in 1934. Seeing as how Alice Corley James is still alive and was seated in the 4th row of the theater, I hope to contact her soon in order to continue my investigation. From the personal diary of Annabelle McGregor. The 7th of January, 1932. Garrus came home today. He seemed paler than he used to, much more quiet. I wish there was something I could do. I wish I could bring him back to us. But he's gone. I have to accept that. We all have to. As it turns out, the diary of Annabelle McGregor, Garrus Creeley's adoptive mother, for those of you who don't remember, was used in the writing of a 1998 psychological thesis by Catherine Jacobs entitled From Garrus to Hannah, a study as to the effects of child molestation. In this book, the author uses materials from various different child molestation trials to form an in-depth study on the resulting mental scars such experiences can procure in children. Annabelle's entries themselves aren't that relevant, often repeating the same thing over and over, but they do form a cohesive thread between two big events in Garrus Creeley's life: his release from the West Riding Mental Hospital and his journey back to America. According to Annabelle McGregor, 19-year-old Garrus Creeley left his parents a week after returning to them, going off to work in a shoe factory. After being fired for inability to follow proper safety instruction, he worked as an assistant ballet instructor in London. 6 weeks after this, he returned to his parents, where he learned that they had been harboring a secret from him. After Sheridan, his previous adoptive father, had died, Garrus was left to inherit all of his belongings. This included the expansive novel Puppets and the script and score for Puppet Master, the musical version of the same novel. From the personal diary of Annabelle McGregor, 18th of September 1932. Garrus called to tell us that he was leaving. We asked when he was coming home. He hung up after that. It's been 4 days, and I'm beginning to believe that I won't see him ever again. Not much is known about Garrus Creeley after that. The next existing record of him is in a financial statement in 1933 concerning an inquiry for a choreographer for the Puppet Master's regime. It would appear that Garrus was continuing his adoptive father's work. Why on earth Garrus Creeley would drop everything in his life to continue the work of his parental rapist is beyond all logical comprehension. One reason could be that he wanted to understand his father more. He was, after all, Sheridan's son. Perhaps he understood how much Puppet Master had meant to him, and he had devoted himself to polishing up the production. In Catherine Jacobs' book, she details a great many examples of this. In the letter from Garrus to the aforementioned choreographer, he writes, "I hope to enliven the production with a bit of playful mystery, such as the essence of the original novel format." I don't have the complete manuscript for Puppets, though Catherine Jacobs apparently does own a small snippet of about 200 pages. God only knows how she acquired it. She lists a total of 17 excerpts in her book, from what I've read. The prose of Puppets is very difficult to understand. One might assume that Sheridan hadn't ever stopped writing it, and had never revised. The story itself follows the main character Marauder as he goes off on an adventure to explore his own sexual agenda upon the request of a puppet that he meets in a dream. To get a feel for the odd, flowery nature of the writing, here's an excerpt. "The puppet was as black as night upon the cold winter eve of Lamastide. Light and airy, yet weak and bitterly sharp. Upon sensing the figure's wooden presence, he scattered himself about the room, unable to find a proper door or window to relieve his urge to escape the angry monstrosity. His eyes danced along the riverway of contempt, stealing glances of the form that beckoned for him to remain motionless. Defeated, he rested himself within his own terror, bending as he slipped into his remorse and fear. I have nothing to work on but the vague points provided by Miss Jacobs for this assumption, but I gather that Garrus used his inheritance to fund the production of the Puppet Master's regime. In the box 34 Creeley Wright, I found a small folder full of production notes from Garrus that I had glossed over in my previous search. Nothing of great importance stands out other than the pitch Creeley used to gain attention of several theater owners who were interested in housing the production. In this, Garrus describes the show as upbeat, fraught with flowery production numbers, and a moral all ages can relate to. I feel like this is a good time to bring up my meeting with Miss Alice Corley James. I made sure to phone her grandchildren for permission to visit, for which I was declined 3 times. After I sent the cake, they understood my presence, and I was granted access. It was a 6-hour drive to the home of Alice Corley James. Her granddaughter was hospitable enough, well, as hospitable as someone can be when they obviously don't want you in their house. She took me to the living room and offered me some cake, which I declined. A few minutes later, I met Alice, who limped her way onto the couch with a plate of cake in her hand. I tried speaking with her, but she refused to talk to me until she had finished eating. I took an instant liking to the old bat, nutty as she was. Throughout the following Q&A, Alice made it very apparent that she had reviewed her facts, and they seemed rehearsed and tired coming from her lips. But I didn't think much of it. From the Testament of Alice Corley James, 1926 to present. How old were you when you saw the Puppet Master's regime? 9? I had just turned 9 that Wednesday, and we were going to have a party the following Saturday. What do you remember about the production? I don't truly remember a lot about the show. I was young, I was hyperactive, and I was bored. Bored to tears by the entire thing. It was so very monotonous and so blandly staged. I recall watching the 3 kitties dancing the exact same motion, twist, tap, for almost 4 minutes, all while the ensemble walked in crisp lines. It was so awkward. That little boy playing the main character, Maury something or other, was a bit quiet, if you asked me. He sort of mumble-spoke, squinting the entire show. Those vague, squinty eyes were bland, too. I fell asleep halfway through Act 1. And do you remember the end of Act 1? No. When I woke up, my parents were dragging me out of the theater. I spent the next 3 hours waiting by the street with my mother while my father searched for his brother. Our Uncle Devin was the assistant choreographer, you see. He died backstage. I think a lift collapsed. I don't know. It was only when I was 30 did they actually tell me what happened, though I remember that they never acted the same again. Did your uncle keep any documentation of his time working on the production? I wouldn't know. We weren't all that close to him, you see. If he did, where could I find those documents? Well, either they're still at the theater, or... My father... Oh, yes. My father probably had them. I remember the policeman delivering a box to us. Your best chance of finding it would be in the attic. We moved all of my father's old office documents into a red... Yes, it was red. A red chest. If it wasn't there, it was most likely thrown away. Mrs. James's granddaughter aided me in my search, and together we found the red chest, as well as Devin Corley's belongings. They had been shoved into a small storage crate within the chest, sloppily strewn in wrinkled chunks of paper. I offered Alice the opportunity to rifle through the crate, but she politely shooed me out of the house before asking for another piece of cake. At first, I couldn't make much sense of the contents within the box. There are a few bills, some production notes, a list of ensemble performers. However, one particular sheet of paper does catch my interest. The audition notes for the role of Marauder. For those of you who don't remember, this was the character whose actor was last seen begging the audience to help him on the night of the Puppet Master's premiere. Not many names are found in this file, oddly enough. Just 14 boys and 6 girls. Underneath the various names are notes over the auditions. Notes that say, too cheeky, too quiet, too mumble-mouthed, but about 3/4 into the paper, the name Timmy Wright is circled 3 times, a small star etched beside it. "He's the one," the note read boldly. I've done a bit of research on this performer as well. Timothy Cartwright was born in August 16th of 1923. His father, Vincent Cartwright, was a lighting designer for a theater on Broadway. His wife, Margie, was a costume designer, though little is known about the beginning of Timothy's career, but by the age of 9 he had taken the vaudeville world by storm as Timothy Cutie Pie Wright, or Cutie Wright for short. As far as I can gather, his only Broadway credit before the Puppet Master's regime was in a semi-successful flop called Joyful Hooligans, in which he played a young British boy who falls off a ship and is taken in by a band of American teenage pickpockets. Devin Corley's diary details the arrival of Timmy to the theater. He says that Timmy was asked to be dropped off in the lobby without his parents. Garris Creeley instructed the staff not to enter the lobby for an hour. At the end of this hour, Garris Creeley himself came through the lobby doors and found Timmy still in his seat by the reception desk. He was quoted to have looked confused and scared, with a look in his eyes that likened to an old cat, weak and defenseless. Garris led him back to his office, where he waited for his parents to return to sign the paperwork. The next few entries of Dennis Corley's diary describe the hiring of the rest of the cast and crew. Shirley Taxam was signed on to play Chawhunt for 3 weeks, died in an automobile accident and was replaced by Sally Wilkes. Henry Gregory, another vaudeville performer who had worked with Timmy at least twice before, was signed on to play Ottlebit. Other cast members, including Fernando Perrin as Mr. Obisker, and Grace Day as Madame Reperio. A casting for the Man in Black, as well as the puppet dressed in black, are not listed. Set design was done by Abraham Durate, and costumes were done by Julianne White. Lighting and direction was taken up by Garris Creeley himself. For the first 2 weeks of production, Dennis Corley's description of Creeley doesn't seem too interesting. A bit eccentric, a bit of a perfectionist, but he's also described as jolly and surreal, like the Santa impersonators that you see at the department stores. He was always cracking jokes, and for the most part, he had a good attitude. However, as innocent as his behavior seemed, even from the beginning, he has a strange obsession with Timothy Wright. Corley details an instance where Timothy was clearly getting the choreography wrong, and yet Garris berates the other children for messing him up. From Dennis Corley's perspective, he coddles the boy and barely even directs him. Now, as lighthearted as he was, Garris Creeley was also a rather strict director. Devin Corley claims that each of the cast members was to arrive at 4 in the morning, 2 hours before crew arrived, simply for vocal exercises and warm-ups. One entry states, the ensemble was placed into 3 lines, and the children were lined up in front. Mr. Creeley would spend 15 minutes going over the exact same tap routines each morning. He always had Timmy do it first. Then the others were to follow. Afterwards, everyone was to gather in a circle for vocal warm-ups. It would start by going through the ranges. Then Garris had us do that awful dance. There were to be 2 circles, one inside the other, and the cast would hold hands. Then both circles were to dance around in opposite directions. The outer circle began to chant first, crying out, Simmental, Simmental, while the inner circle yelled out, Freyla, Freyla. Both chants were ensemble vocals that had been cut from the production, but Mr. Creeley saw fit to include them every morning, saying that they were perfect vocal warm-ups. Garris's impatience continues throughout the rehearsal. He grows violent. and more cast members report to Darren that Sally Wilkes exhibited bruises on her upper arm. The script was modified weekly, putting the company in great stress. Timmy Wright was the one who took most of the damage, as most of the changes gave his character more lines, placing him under a lot of pressure. He was often asked to visit Creeley's office for private readings, where he'd stay for hours. Tragedy enters the life of Timothy Cartwright on August 13, 1933, when he and his family had been the victims of an automobile accident which killed his father and severely injured both his mother and he. Tevin writes that for a month and a half, Garris visited Timothy daily and eventually stopped coming to rehearsal altogether. The principal choreographer, Mandis Thorman, took up the role of director during that time. It was also during that time that they sought out the employment of 14-year-old Rory Atkins to be the understudy for Timmy. Devon writes that it was at the conspiring of Thorman and the producers that Rory would eventually replace Timmy. "This cute Wright," writes one producer, "is completely inept in the art of performance. His delivery is too big, his eyes are too big, his presence is too big, and for all that bigness, he has a shockingly little amount of talent and discipline. Mr. Creeley spoils the boy and hardly gives a scrap of motivational honesty in the direction of anyone else. In short, Timothy Cartwright must go." While Garris Creeley was gone, the production staff also persisted in cutting certain things from the show. This included a number that occurred midway through Act 2. A gibberish number sang by an army of puppets that they say slowed down the production. Creeley was quite unhappy with this, giving them several angry phone calls about the matter, and they eventually gave him an ultimatum: cut the number completely or put it somewhere else. Garris placed it at the end of Act 1. Devon notes that Garris would tell the children to practice this number on their own time, and when they did run through it during rehearsals, it was in segments, never in its entirety. The number itself contained one group of lyrics that was repeated over and over again. Garris made it painfully clear that the company has to sing these stanzas exactly 100 times before they could take a break during the intermissions, even if the curtains had closed before they were finished. Devon's journal ends with a relief from notes throughout. Instead, he explains an event that he himself was present for. I think it's best to probably just read the section itself. "Nobody was ever allowed in Mr. Creeley's office but Mr. Creeley and Timmy. I assumed Mr. Creeley would want to meet Rory, but never asked for an audition with him. However, Mandis had instructed me to deliver 3 resignation letters to Mr. Creeley's desk, and I went to my task. When I came in, the room was all mussed and hot, like there wasn't even air conditioning in there. The windows were down, but my vision adapted fairly quickly. I saw that on the floor was a worn mattress with plates and cups all around. I blinked in surprise. Rushing over to the bedding, I saw that it had definitely been in use for quite a while. I wondered in astonishment if Mr. Creeley had been living in the theater. And when I considered the idea, I did recall that he'd put all of his money into this show, and we never heard him ask us to send papers to his house, only his office. Along the far end of the room were a few piles of shirts and trousers. It was still very dark, so I didn't focus on them too much. I went to set the papers down on the desk when, against my better judgment, I had the urge to snoop around a bit. I looked over the top of the desk. Nothing but pens and scrambled folders. Then went right to the corner drawer. What was inside the drawer frightens me more now than it did when I saw them. Within the drawer was a gun. A bit eccentric, maybe, but I thought nothing of it. as well as a worn, hand-painted mask. Red in color, it was put into a shape of a doll's face. A puppet's. Beside the mask was a small journal. I opened it and found the pages to be yellowed with age. The pages themselves concealed mad writings that were barely legible, but I could tell by the drawing that it was some sort of worshipper's guide. There were these charcoal sketches of a puppet, a giant puppet, that controlled the world on strings protruding from its fingernails. Other pictures showed the puppet walking amongst common men who couldn't see it. There was a man stroking the bodies of his wife and children, a young girl being brought for the night by an older gentleman, two twins being held down on their bed by some invisible force, all pictures in which the puppet stood by grinning. I placed the journal back into the drawer, but then I noticed the mask. The mask had the same face that the puppet had. An insane grin, wide eyes, puffy cheeks. It was only when I held it closer to my face did I notice it also shared the features of Timmy. The same mouth, the same nose, the same eyes. I shoved the mask back into the drawer and shut it quickly. My curiosity morphed into sickness. I backed away from the desk and hit the wall. Turning to my right, I felt my right foot come into contact with the pile of clothes that I saw earlier. My eyes had completely adjusted to the dark by now, and I could see that not all of the shirts and trousers were in Mr. Creeley's size. At least 4 of them were smaller. The clothes a young boy would wear. I grabbed the papers off the desk and ran out. I delivered them to Mr. Creeley's hand that afternoon. And after that, there are 7 pages blank in the journal of Devon Corley. There are no more entries. At the bottom of this crate, however, was a newspaper dated October 3rd, 1935. The headline reads, "Flower Shop Vandal Strikes Again." And on the 3rd page is a small section dedicated to the disaster that occurred at the August Wilson Theater on October 1st. Oddly enough, the article doesn't mention the Puppet Master's regime by name more than once, but it focuses on the aftermath. In an interview, the police officer Jeremy Winthrop, "We ain't got no idea what could have happened. We got a call from a diner down the street, talking about some riot going down at the August Wilson. We came to find a bunch of theater-goers crying and begging for help. They just kept saying, 'They're dead, they're dead, they're really dead.' We went inside, but we didn't find nothing." You see, 76 attendants of the 1935 showing went missing. 98 if you count the theater company, whose bodies were never recovered from the stage, though many testified to have seen them die. Others claimed to have seen people collapsing in the aisles. When the police investigated the theater, they saw that one of the lifts backstage had collapsed, but there were no traces of anyone there. The only bodies recovered was that of Garris Creeley. He had been found in his office, a bullet in his head. Other than that, nothing. No blood, no struggles. Those 98 people were never seen again. After that, there's nothing left in the crate but barely visible photos of cast members and fabric samples of costumes. At this point, my investigation to the Puppet Master's regime ended. Or at least, the historical investigation. Do you remember the revival of the Puppet Master that I mentioned at my first entry? Well, the first preview performance will take place in Chicago on September 18th. I've already booked balcony seats. Being a full-time investigator for an obscure pornographic musical doesn't lend itself to much of an earning, you see. And I'll be attending this showing where I'll record the audio, take notes on the production, and I'll do a detailed run-through of the production the day after I see it. Investigation will resume September 18th. Update. September 20th. Alright, I never got around to posting the previous investigation. I know, it was irresponsible, but during my wait for Puppet Master, I started actually paying attention to my college courses. And I never really had time to revise my first draft. So I suppose I'll just have to post my findings in one long entry, as I've seen the revival of Puppet Master. The experience was odd. It's hard to remember the things that went wrong until I run through the entire thing in my head. It's easier to write about the first act in that way, I guess. I know that doesn't really make sense when you put it to words, but it's hard to explain, but enough of my cryptic build-up. I arrived in Chicago last week, where I stayed with a couple of old high school friends for a few days. We had fun catching up, but I never took my mind off of the Puppet Master's regime. The theater that housed the production was rather obscure, located a few miles out from the main city, and none of the news articles that I've read post-preview have mentioned the name of that theater, so I can only imagine that they don't want the publicity. Upon entering the theater, I was given a playbill by a cheery man in a suit, an older gentleman with a weak smile on his face. The playbill itself showed the white silhouette of a young boy. Several puppet strings attached to a scribbly red and black heart that hung within his chest. There were white dollies hanging all around him. I remember thinking that it was odd that a preview playbill would be in color, as those usually aren't printed until the show starts making money. Well, anyway, I made it to my seat and began to read through the playbill itself. I didn't much care about the names of the cast members, though I do recall seeing the pictures for a boy playing the part of Marauder, a 14-year-old named Milton Holliday. And the show opened to a long, plodding overture, played mostly with piano, with these odd whistles being played through the speakers all around the theater. And after about 5 minutes, the music changed to a more bouncy, lighthearted tune, and the curtain came up. The stage was empty. Nothing but the projected backdrop of a village square with these old clouds floating above. About 10 children in 18th century Germany clothing skipped on stage, playing with balloons and dolls. As the music progressed, a small mechanical horse wheeled its way on stage. The lights dimmed, and the children stopped. The horse dragged along a cart, upon which a small, curtained puppet box faced the audience. As the cart came to a stop, a large puppet in a black robe flew out from behind the curtain, and the children screamed and backed away. And then the puppet spoke. "Good day, little ones. What a wondrous day for a bout of play, isn't it? Now don't you be frightened, sweetlings. The puppet dressed in black has a tale to weave, and someone has to hear it. Why, even if a story isn't terribly uplifting, it's the relevance of the story that matters, isn't it? Now gather my popinjays. For this story, I'm afraid, requires the keen ears of a curious child. For only the innocent can see things simply, without the distractions of growth. The children looked at each other, then slowly began to gather around the cart. Once they were all seated, the puppet let out a chilling laugh. "That's the spirit, kiddies," he spoke. "Now this is a story about many things, about love and hate, about dark and light, about the difference between right and wrong, and the difference between wrong and right. But at the core, this is a story about a little boy named Raider." And with that, the light on the cart fades away, and a light fades in on a small boy holding a broom, smiling proudly. Raider. The rest of the prologue is rather bland, and I can't remember or decipher the audio to much of the exposition. The puppet, Raider, and Mr. Obscur share a song. We learn that Raider was an orphan who Mr. Obscur found on the side of the street 5 years ago, and has since put him to work in his puppet shop. The costumes from this point seem much less historically accurate from the opening scene. Everyone's costumes seem faded and bland in color scheme, but each of the outfits are ridiculously frilly and layered. Some of the story's exposition is changed. For example, Raider's last name, Obeisance, has been reapplied from the novel on which the story was based. The staging and set design is oddly reminiscent of Andrew Lloyd Webber's The Woman in White. Most of the sets are made up of hyper-realistic projections that give the illusion of a moving camera. However, unlike The Woman in White, there are far more set pieces which actually have moving images projected on them, like the revival of Sunday in the Park with George. For example, during one of the opening songs, I can hear them whisper. We see Raider sweep up along the puppet shop. We watch as the front desk and 2 puppet display shelves spin around on the turntable as the projected background spins slightly faster, adding in ominous shadows and subtle lighting changes. It was dizzying, but effective. Most of the Act 1's exposition seemed rather harmless, in my opinion. It almost seems like the start of a Disney show. However, I did find my inner critic rolling his eyes at some of the lyrics, my personal favorite being, "He pretended he was crying, though they told me he was lying, and he's a sickly boy, knowing not of joy." However, upon comparing the new version to what I've heard about with the other two, there are some significant changes to the show. For example, the character of Madame Repario has been cut completely. After the cutesy song Get a Puppet, we are taken to the center of the village, and here we have one of the songs that had been cut in the previous version, entitled Whittletime, in which the villagers celebrate a holiday of the same name. The celebration focuses on villagers dancing around with a puppet and doll made out of random objects such as twigs, scraps, and clothing, and cornstalks. The music is charming, like a folk song, although the lyrics don't seem to make much sense. Dancing as we pither, though the wilting and woe, evermore aligned along the ever-growing row, eyes without a trace of tone or livelihood, and so rise and rejoice for a Whittletime song, and the willows will wander all Whittletime long. Here, the song where the children sell dolls is used as a bridge in the Whittletime sequence. Another change is the rearranging of the wind and whisperings, a song that was originally played in Act 2. In this new version, it's sung monotonously by a group of black-clad people mourning the loss of a young girl, a rape victim. The sequence itself is It's so strange. Around 8 people walk on stage, 4 of them carrying a small open coffin, and the lighting goes from yellow-orange to blue, and the chorus drones on for about 8 minutes as they somewhat explain how the girl died. The wind was her muse for play, and she pranced along the riverway. She slipped along the sides of the weeping willow's hairs, and she danced along the riverway with narrow remorse. The whisperings from far away, calling out for her to stay. She stayed there with the wind and the whisperings of yore, and she danced with him until he saw fit to take her source. Again, this uncomfortable ensemble song goes on for about 8 minutes. From what I could assume, the little girl had been playing along the river when a man asked her to stay with him until nighttime, where he tied her down before a policeman stopped him right as the girl had perished. Other than that, most of Act 1 seemed the same as the other versions, given there is a small bit where a girl with a puppet mysteriously appears and disappears while Marauder sweeps up the shop, and a random scene right before the finale in which Mr. Obaskar sings about the hardships of raising Marauder, a song reworked from the same song Madame Raperio sang in 1934. The finale song itself, which so many people had claimed held some sort of force to it in the 1934 production, didn't seem all that powerful. Though this may be due to a rewrite. The 1934 version was said to be significantly longer than the 1928 workshop, and at around 12 minutes of non-stop gibberish lyrics. The version had a reprise of The Wind and the Whisperings, followed by a few verses told through the old language. The lyrics are in fact somewhat odd-sounding after 2 minutes of non-stop strobe lighting, but I wasn't that affected by it. There weren't any deaths after the finale, at least. Though, intermission did last 10 minutes longer than it was supposed to due to technical difficulties backstage. Act 2 was where most of the changes seemed to be. It began with a light on Marauder being strung up on ropes like a puppet, his friends and Mr. Obaskar hanging on each side of him. A new song plays, where all the songs from Act 1 are placed into a montage, while the Act 1 finale music plays in the background. And just as the music shifts to the pounding Whittle Time music, Marauder awakens. And remember when I mentioned that Act 2 was mostly made up of a bunch of songs played one after the other for no apparent reason? Most of that's been cut. The only 2 songs from that long, drawn-out sequence are What Is This Place? And Marauder's Soliloquy, which has been renamed to Marauder Confronts the Puppet, and has been changed to a duet sequence. The lyrics have been improved, whereas the 1934 show had lyrics such as this. What is this place? What are you aiming? This isn't well, sir. Why are we gaming? This isn't a game. The improved lyrics are, what is this place? Wait, am I dreaming? This isn't real, no, nor what it's seeming. It's all a dream. It's still a little clunky, but at least they make sense now. And the particular scenes that I listed before involved a panicking Marauder confronting the puppet dressed in black, who explains that Marauder's soul once belonged to a child rapist, and that he died before the puppet could punish him. This is where the set design becomes a bit odd. There were several floor-to-ceiling metal dollies that would constantly roll about on stage, as if to symbolize Marauder walking somewhere, and the backdrop went red, and there were projections of puppets flinging the corpses of children along the walls. To say it was unsettling would be an understatement. After this, the story progresses in a similar manner as the 1928 workshop, but with different twists. Marauder learns that the odd-looking man in black from the first act was the boy that Marauder raped in the past life. The man in black wants to revisit their relationship, but Murader wants nothing to do with him. They spend the next 10 minutes singing about what might have been, and Murader begins to remember things. He ends up seducing and dominating the man in black, while a group of children acrobats frolic along the long sheets of fabric above them. And just then, the puppet dressed in black shows up and orders the old man to go away. He explains to Murader that his punishment is to forever serve him, aiding in the future murder of children in the village where he lives. As they both sing the title song, several children, including the little girl who drowned in Act 1, join in, all holding miniature puppets dressed in black. The new ending is a bit confusing, but apparently they're saying that pedophilia is some sort of vicious cycle. When one dies, his soul is placed into that of a newborn child who will, by fate, become one themselves. This influences them to be. Murader, as well as several other children, manage to defy destiny by escaping their respective rapists, which results in their being enlisted into the puppet master's regime. It makes so little sense, and it's so damn creepy. Then, just like in the 1928 workshop, all of Murader's friends are returned to the puppet shop, but none of them have any memory of Murader. We cut back to the cart from the prologue, where we see all the children have disappeared, and from the back of the puppet box, Murader and the man in black exit from behind the curtains. They hop upon the horse and begin to trot their way out of town. As they exit the village, they hear a small girl's terrified screams. She lunges out in front of the cart. She begins to beg Murader and the man to help her, and just as the old man rushes out in pursuit, he insists that he is the girl's father. But she sobs that she's never met him before. Panicked, Murader pulls on the horse reins and runs over the man, killing him. And the man in black turns to Murader, and his voice low whispers, "Murader, what have you done?" Before the lights go out. However, right after this scene is where things quickly became wrong. The lights slowly fade up from the green tint of the forest into a deep blue, similar to the lighting during the wind and the whispering. The entire company slips out from backstage holding their miniature puppets, staring directly at the audience. And just then, the lights begin to flash and the puppets... And I know this sounds kind of stupid to say, but they sang. I don't mean that the children sang while controlling the puppets' mouths. The puppets... they actually sang. And oh God, the song. It was the same gibberish from the Act 1 finale. The children, the adults, all of them were holding puppets. They chanted those horrible words over and over again, their eyes unblinking, focused on the audience. Trapped in our own seats, we were forced to listen to the song repeat itself over and over, and I saw that the cast had begun to move the puppets around in jerking, near-erotic dance moves, and every now and again twitching in unison with the rest of the company. And after a while, I began to feel sick. We were all sick. I could see people in front of me leave their seats, ready to leave. I tried tuning the chants out, but that only seemed to make them worse. The music pounded within me, causing me to jerk about with each pounding drum. As if I reached back in my seat, I realized something. The pounding within me wasn't just from the orchestra. It was from beneath me. For a moment, I could see that everyone else could see it too. For a faint moment, we could feel the ground beneath us quake along with the chants. I looked up to see if the cast had noticed, but then I saw the puppets. They were still dancing and moving within their performers' grasps, but the performers themselves were not moving their arms. And then for a moment, we all found relief. From backstage, several crew members rushed on the stage, pushing several actors away in the process, and one of them screamed out, "Fire! Shit!" And then the chaos began. From above the stage, all the lights began to shoot off. The projections behind the actors flickered briefly before shutting off entirely, and the company screamed, as did the audience. In a flash of fire and sparks, the actors began to leap off stage, and we all began to pile out the door. I still had a headache. I could still hear the pounding. The fire department arrived shortly after the theater was evacuated. About 10 minutes before the trucks arrived, we heard the back of the theater collapse. I've since checked the articles online, and 60-plus attendants of that show, 9 of them being the cast and crew, have gone missing. As it turned out, most of the people who didn't leave the parking lot were either helping out like me, or were too shaken up to drive. And when I finally began to walk towards my car, a gurney was wheeled right past me. The man that I saw laying there unconscious and hooked up to an oxygen tank was the same man who handed me the playbill. I drove back to my friend's apartment and went straight to bed. Even in my sleep, I could still hear the pounding. By morning, my headache had stopped, but the memory of the night before still lingered. I went to my computer straight away to upload the audio that I had recorded. My camera tends to divide long videos into smaller ones, and I immediately deleted the last video. Nobody ever needed to hear that, especially not me. I listened to the recording again, making notes in word processor as I went along, and I found myself humming to some of the more bouncy tunes. The pounding slowly fading away. My fear of the show has lessened. The idea of supernatural forces destroying the theater seemed far too ridiculous for me to take seriously, and I brushed the fear aside. Once that was done, I went to work scanning the playbill. And after scanning the front, I went to work scanning the interior pages. A bit curious, I skimmed through some of the production names. And it was then, right there on the third page, I saw the picture of the man who had handed me the playbill. The man was the head producer-director. A cheery old man with a wrinkled face, looking away from the camera, and below his picture in bold letters read the name Timothy Cartwright. My face scrunched. My breath went still. All I could hear was the faint memory of the pounding. That isn't right, I told myself. It isn't possible. It's a different person. It had to be. Timothy Cartwright died on October 1st, 1935, at the premiere of The Puppet Master's Regime. Everyone saw it. Everyone saw him begging for help, strung up on strings. This isn't possible. In my interview, and then I remembered something. In my interview with Alice Corley James, she mentioned narrator's squinty eyes and his monotonous acting, and Timothy Wright was known for his wide-eyed expressions and over-the-top delivery. It's what made him famous. The person performing narrator that night in 1934 must have been Rory Atkins, the understudy. That and Garrus Creeley had been found dead, killed by a gunshot to the head. Everyone assumed that it was suicide. Nobody even suspected murder. I remembered Devon's journal, the puppet's mask, the clothes, the fascination Garrus Creeley had with the little cutie Wright, and nobody even suspected murder. Why would they? And then to add to my revelation, I realized that among the cast members who had escaped from the theater, there was one boy seated in the back seat of his mother's car. The vague, empty face of Milton Holiday. Narrator. The Puppet Master's Regime is not a simple musical. I've come to realize it's more than just a production. It's a force, an entity even. It's not just a madman's sick, elaborate scheme to... It isn't just a young boy's obsession over destroying his father's work. It isn't only an innocent victim's last attempt at showing the world how he was wronged. It's a greater monster than that, and within the writing and music of this show is something I don't know what, and I don't want to know what, some kind of monster that refuses to die. And people who saw the Puppet Master's regime in both 1928 and 1934 were said to have suffered from long-life mental effects, causing them to hum tunes that they had heard only once. And even now, as I type, I quietly hum the sick, demented tune of Never Mind Me, Mister. And when I sleep, the wind and the whispering refuses to rid itself from my subconscious. I find myself thinking about this production night and day, singing and thinking about possible depths to certain subplots and songs. And what's worse is I know that someday another revival of the demented work will make its way onto stage. Milton Holiday is still alive, isn't he? And this evil won't rest until it remakes itself again. I've decided not to post any more of my findings. This includes the audio taken of my revival, and I suggest that none of you ever attempt to look further into the matter. It simply isn't worth it. A few days after writing this, I read a few articles about the fire at the theater and those 60+ missing people. The fire department has been searching through the rubble. None of the bodies have been found. Consider this a warning. In the event that it ever comes to you during a moment of weakness as it did me all those years ago, say no to the pastel man. It doesn't matter how much you love the person that it promises to help. Nothing is worth what it wants in return. I tell you this in hopes that you don't make the same mistake that I did that cold winter night, kneeling beside my father's writhing body on the living room floor. It was 1997 when I first encountered the creature, and ever since not a day has gone by where its awful face hasn't haunted my thoughts. I was a teenager then, but I look at that evening as the night my childhood died, corrupted and violated by a callous hell beast with pure blue skin. Even though it happened years ago, I still remember the events of that fateful first encounter vividly. I could tell you what my father and I were wearing, the toppings on the pizza that we were eating, even the score of the football game playing on the TV. It was around halftime when my father's speech started to become slurred, which I found odd since he had been nursing the same bottle of beer since kickoff. Stranger even, I had seen him drink a six-pack to himself in the past without even appearing tipsy, so I was having trouble understanding how a single drink could have such an effect on him. I realized it wasn't the alcohol, when half his body went limp and he slid off the couch. I asked him if he was alright, but his words had now become incomprehensible. I grabbed the phone off the coffee table and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I think my dad is having a stroke. The thought had only crossed my mind a second before the operator answered the phone. Okay, we have your address. An ambulance is on its way. It should be there soon. Is he conscious? Yes, he is, but I can't understand him. Nonsensical, jumbled sounds were rambling out of my father's mouth. I was afraid. He was all I had. My mother passed away when I was a baby, so I never got the chance to know her, but my dad was always there for me, doing the job of two parents. If I lost him, then I would be alone. That's normal with strokes. It's good that he's awake. And I didn't hear the rest because that's when I dropped the phone. I was having one of those moments where everything faded into the background while my world felt silent. The football game played on the television. The operator giving me instructions over the phone, even the sound of my father's voice as he wailed in agony on the carpet became white noise. Dissolving into the air as I lost all awareness of my surroundings, all of my attention and focus was now on one thing. The horrible abomination that was standing in my kitchen watching my father and I with a twisted smile across its disgusting face, its head narrowly missing, scraping against our kitchen's 9-foot ceiling as it shifted from side to side, fidgeting with anticipation like a giddy child in class on the last day of school, waiting for the final bell to signal summer vacation. The pastel blue skin that covered its entire body, from the creature's head all the way down to its feet, horrible, grimy feet, looked weathered and wrinkled like leather that had been left out in the sun for days. Hanging off its long, lanky frame was a plain brown satchel with black stitching. It lightly caressed the strap of the pouch with a long finger while it looked on with an eager expression on its face. At first I thought that I had gone mad from the sight of seeing my father have a stroke, but the closer the monstrosity slinked towards us, the more I realized it was no hallucination. It ducked its head under the light fixture in the living room and stepped a spindly leg over the couch. Though the monstrous freak of nature was clearly bipedal, it had moved down to all fours and appeared to be stalking us, like some wild animal hunting its prey. I should have been terrified. But the horrible smile on its god-awful face made me feel more anger towards the thing than fear. It was as if it was taking pleasure in my father's misery. Closer still it crept, and I grabbed my father's hand out of desperation in some veiled attempt to protect him. The creature stopped, its face mere inches from mine before shifting its attention down to my father. I can save him, if you'd like. I was taken aback. I'd prepared for the terrible thing to take a chunk of flesh out of my neck with its teeth, or slash me across the face with its black, crusty nails. But speaking to me was the last thing I expected. He is dying, but I can save him, if you like. I sat there, mouth agape, cradling my father's hand in my arm, and staring into the two pink, bulbous eyes that took up more than a third of the foul creature's face. I remember thinking that they reminded me of Easter eggs, a bizarre connection for my mind to make given the situation. It stood back up on 2 feet, and once again I was reminded just how imposing the creature really was. It told me its name, which I dare not repeat because it also explained that speaking it is the best way to summon the beast. For the remainder of my story, I will refer to the entity as the Pastel Man. Just a name I came up with due to the pigmentation of its skin and the light shade of pink that was the color of its eyes. That, and for some reason, giving the creature a silly name always helped to make me feel less afraid of it. Not much less, though. Finally, my mind had recovered enough from shock to allow me to stutter out a few words. What do you mean you can save him? What I do is make deals, young man. Its voice was surprisingly angelic, like 1,000 choirs all singing in unison. If one were to close their eyes while the creature spoke to them, they might imagine that they were listening to a seraph, not the hideous monster that was sporting a depraved grin in my living room. However, its extraordinary voice only managed to make me feel more uneasy. It wasn't right that something so beautiful would belong to such a repulsive creature. The Pastel Man gestured to its satchel. I have the ability to save your father's life. But you have to agree to a deal with me. What kind of a deal? Everything happens for a reason. Even death. Its mischievous smile widened just a bit, as if the creature was getting to a punchline of a joke. It's true that I can save your father's life, but someone must die in his place. One shall die, so another may live. That's the deal. I clutched my chest. Not you. What would be the point? No, I'm giving you the option to choose the person who will be replacing your father this evening. I was stunned by what I was hearing. Are you death? The pastel man threw its head back and let out a terrible howl. It was only later that I would come to realize that was how the wretched thing laughed. No, I'm clearly not the Grim Reaper, although you aren't the first person to ask me that. I'm not the devil either, nor do I work for him. Let's just say I'm an independent contractor, shall we? Two tiny holes that lied on the center of its face in the absence of a nose flared in satisfaction of its explanation. Can I choose anyone? Well, not anyone. That wouldn't be fun, would it? I could see a row of shark-like teeth behind its mouth as it separated its lips to speak. Your father's replacement must be someone else in your life. I'm not a murderer. My voice was tiny. It barely escaped my mouth. I looked back down to my father. He had lost consciousness and his skin was becoming pale. I don't think I could kill anyone, I know. You don't have to murder anyone, young man. The sly creature was moving into its final pitch. All you have to do is tell me who it is you want dead, and I'll do the rest. Surely, there must be someone you wouldn't mind out of your life. A teacher. An ex-girlfriend. A rival at school, perhaps. There was. I had fantasies about it many times, but never in my wildest dreams would I have actually acted on it. Everyone has that person in their life who's toxic. Someone who makes getting up in the morning more difficult, and I was certainly no exception. Walter Flanagan, I muttered under my breath. Who? Walter Flanagan. He's the guy at school who gave me this. I lifted my shirt and showed it the handprint-shaped bruise on my chest that Walter had given me during one of his infamous hazing sessions in the locker room earlier that week. He's been shoving me into lockers and beating me up since I was a freshman. The faculty doesn't do anything since he's the best football player in the history of our school. He's a 5-star recruit going to a huge college next year. ESPN even did a piece on him. Ah. The pastel man began to snicker to itself. It somehow widened its already enormous pink eyes even more, then crouched back down to get face to face with me again. What fun is being a king? Without serfs to torment, huh? I'm tired of being tormented, so just go kill him before I change my mind. The pastel man shot a massive hand out and wrapped its long fingers around my face. The grin that it was wearing since I first laid eyes on it had now been replaced by a scowl. You do not tell me what to do. Are we clear? I nodded sheepishly. The grip it had on my face was so tight, I understood then and there that if it wanted to, the creature could easily snap my neck or crush my skull like an egg. Good. Because it's not so simple, young man. There are steps that must be taken. Steps? Yes. A playful smirk once again returned to the pastel man's face. You will have to be present when this Walter Flanagan dies. In fact, I need you to summon me, or else I can't complete my end of the bargain. Get the boy alone and speak my name. You must watch him die by sunrise, or else you will be violating the terms of our agreement. So, do we have a deal? I nodded again, and the monster released its hold of my face before snatching my hand. Its giant paws swallowed my palm as we shook to cement the deal. Excellent! With this handshake, our deal is binding, young man. I watched curiously as the pastel man reached into its satchel and fumbled around until it found what it was looking for. In between its repugnant fingers, it held a strange-looking insect, about the size of a quarter. The bug buzzed its wings in an attempt to flutter away, but could not escape the pastel man's grasp. With its other hand, it pushed down my father's jaw in order to open it. What are you doing?" I asked. But the pastel man did not answer. It then violently stuffed the insect in my father's mouth, jamming it down his esophagus with its filthy fingers. The pastel man rose once more to its feet. There. The deed is done. Your father will recover in full. Now, it's your turn. Remember, the boy dies by sunrise or the deal is off. It turned its back to me and began to slither away. What if I change my mind? The creature stopped almost mid-stride and twisted around. Again, its smile had been supplanted by an awful sneer. I felt less safe than when it was holding my face in a vice grip earlier. Your father's health has already been restored, so someone must replace him. One must die, so another shall live. That was the deal. If you fail to complete your end of the bargain, then that someone will be you. Believe me when I say this, young man. I don't need to be summoned once our deal has been broken. I will come for you. That is a promise. And when I do, you're going to wish you never crossed me. With that, it continued out the kitchen and through the back door. I chased after it, but by the time I got outside into the backyard, the thing had disappeared. It was then that I spotted the lights of the ambulance as it pulled across the street from my house. I flagged down the EMTs and led them to my father. It wasn't difficult to find Walter. I knew exactly where he was going to be, but I had completely lost track of time while waiting to hear from my father's doctors in the ICU. I had to hurry to Eddie Gillen's house. Eddie's parents were out of town, and he had been talking all week at school about the rager that he had been planning on throwing. There were two things I knew about Walter. One, Eddie was his best friend. And two, he never missed a party. It was somewhere around 3:30 a.m. when I pulled my car up to Eddie's. I parked a little ways down the street so that I wouldn't be spotted. Because I had gotten held up at the hospital, I feared that I had missed my chance to catch Walter. My concerns were alleviated when I saw his raged pickup truck still parked in the driveway. Another thought crossed my mind. What if Walter had gotten too drunk and passed out? I tried to think of a way to get into Eddie's and get Walter alone long enough for the pastel man to do whatever it was that he had planned. Luckily for me, it wasn't too long before Walter stumbled out of Eddie's front door and climbed into his truck. I let out a sigh, having just escaped a potentially challenging problem. He pulled out and I followed behind, staying far enough away so that I wouldn't tip him off. He was drunk. Even from the distance that I was tailing him, I could see his truck swerving in and out of its lane. The pastel man's otherworldly voice played itself over and over like a heavenly broken record in my mind. You must watch him die by sunrise. I wondered if I even had the courage to summon the creature again, ceiling. Seeing it once that night was traumatic enough. Could I really handle looking into its horrible face for a second time? And what about Walter? Even though he was a huge ass, he didn't deserve to die, and certainly not at the hands of that thing. It will kill you if you don't let it kill him. Just remember, you're doing this for Dad. I'm not sure if it was the little angel on my shoulder or the little devil that was whispering in my ear. I looked out my driver's side window. A pink ribbon lined the horizon. The very first signs of sunlight making its presence known in the dark evening sky. In a couple of hours, morning would arrive and I would be too late to complete my end of the bargain. I would see the pastel man again, one way or another. Walter lived up in the foothills outside of town, where some of the wealthier people owned homes. I had been there once for a school project, one where I did all the work and he ended up taking the credit. We had come to a part of the road leading towards his house that cut through a wooded area. I knew that there would be no houses for a stretch, so I decided that was where I would make my move. I sped up until I was tailgating the truck, then started flashing my brights and honking my horn. I was preparing to rear-end him in order to get him to stop driving. But it didn't even take that to get the job done. He must have been panicking. His truck started to swerve violently across the street before running off the road, side-sweeping a tree, and coming to a complete stop. I pulled up behind him and then hesitated for a moment. A glimpse of the creature's grin flashed through my mind, causing me to shudder. I got out of my car, but left the engine running and my headlights on. "Hey, Walter!" I shouted. Walter's door jerked open. He jumped out of the truck to the ground. "Sean, the shithead?" He was confused, but clearly annoyed. Sean the shithead was the nickname that he had affectionately given me on my second week of school. Within a month, he had my entire class calling me that. "You think this is funny? I'm gonna fuck you up, you little bitch." He stormed towards me with both fists clenched. Again, doubts crossed my mind about whether or not I could pull the trigger. Guilt began to pump through my veins. Walter's life was about to end, and it was going to be because of me. Memories darted through my consciousness. All the after-school beatings I took at the hands of Walter, the pastel man's wicked smile, the look on my father's face as he kicked and screamed on the living room floor. Finally, those words, spoken through that unnerving angelic voice of that terrible monster. "One must die, so another shall live." Walter was moving closer. It was now or never. I had to choose whether or not I would summon the beast before the decision was out of my hands. I shouted the pastel man's real name out in a burst of emotion, aimed directly at the star football player. Walter paused for a moment, looking at me in confusion, and then recollected himself and proceeded towards me again. The pastel man was nowhere to be seen. For the second time that evening, I wondered if I had gone insane. Could everything that happened to me that night have been in my head? What was real? Was my father even sick? Again, I repeated the thing's name in an effort to summon it, but this time it did nothing to hinder Walter's pursuit of me. He violently shoved me against the hood of his car, grabbed hold of my shirt collar, and spun me around. Walter raised his fist to hit me, and I winced and put up my hands in order to prepare for impact. But he never struck me. It was only when I opened my eyes that I realized I wasn't crazy. Walter's face was white. His mouth hung open just as mine had when I first caught sight of the pastel man earlier that evening. I turned my head to see that unmistakable, long, lanky body slink out from the shadows and in front of my car's headlights. Its face still wore that warped smile, and I knew just beyond those thin lips was a mouth full of tiny daggers, capable of tearing muscle from bone. Neither Walter nor I said a word. I think I might have been almost as terrified as him. My stomach began to feel sick as the pastel man stalked ever closer. I didn't look at Walter's face. How could I? The boy was about to die at the hands of that horrible monster, and it was my fault. I didn't have to summon it. I didn't have to shake its hand. I'm sorry. I truly was. And I still am. I hadn't taken my eyes off the pastel man, but I think it had more to do with not being able to look at Walter in the face than fear for my life. Walter said nothing. My car's headlights fell on the creature's face, and now we could both see it clearly. The pastel man's large pink eyes seemed to glow bright in the light of the headlamps. Walter let go of me and made a break for his truck, but the hellbeast pounced on him with a surprising amount of speed and agility that I had not yet seen it demonstrate. His screams were met with only apathy from the creature as it dug its filthy black fingernails into Walter's abdomen. I tried to look away, but the pastel man made sure I remembered our agreement. "You must watch, young man! Don't forget we had a deal!" I forced myself to look back at the massacre. The creature's smile had mutated from mischievous to depraved. It looked as if it was deriving some sort of sick sexual pleasure out of the torture that it was putting Walter through. Deeper still, it burrowed its long, bony fingers into Walter's stomach, and with a jerk, the heinous thing yanked out a handful of his intestines and dragged them across the ground as it approached me, flaring those holes on its face that filled in for a nose and clearly pleased with its handiwork. It's over then? I'm not sure if I was asking or begging the creature as the two of us faced each other in the empty street that night. The pastel man threw his head back and once again let out a revolting howl. Over? We're just getting started! It headed back over towards Walter, who at this point was crawling along the ground, still trying to get to his truck while his innards trailed behind him. The pastel man cut him off and snatched him off the asphalt. Easily lifting him by the head with one hand, it toyed with him for a bit, forcing Walter to look into his hideous face. With its free hand, the creature reached into its satchel and pulled out a much bigger insect this time. It was different than the one my father had unknowingly ingested, both in size and in appearance. If the bug that the creature jammed down my father's throat was the size of a quarter, this one must have been as large as a golf ball. It was slimy, the mucus-like membrane that encased the body glistened in my car's headlights. The pastel man dangled the nasty bug in front of Walter's face for a few seconds. "Now be a good boy and open your mouth." Walter screamed. That gave the blue beast the opening that it needed. It thrusted the slimy insect into his mouth and past his tonsils with its filthy fingers. I watched on as Walter gagged, presumably on the oversized maggot, as it made its way down his throat. Soon he began to turn blue. I could tell he was choking to death, and even though I wanted to save him, there was nothing I could do. A minute later, the pastel man dropped his lifeless body to the ground. It examined the carnage for a moment, pondering over it as if it was a masterpiece in an art gallery. Then the demon turned away, retreated back towards the shadows, and disappeared into the night without saying a word. I stood there in the road, looking at the scene and still feeling sick to my stomach from what I had just witnessed. I didn't know what I expected to happen after the deed was done. There was no explosion, no brilliant light show, where I would watch Walter's soul either drag down to hell or ascend upwards towards the heavens, just a dead boy in the road. that dead boy and his murderer. The pastel man was the gun, but I pulled the trigger. In a way, there were 2 dead boys on the road that evening. I knew I didn't have time to dawdle. At any moment, a car could come driving down the street and find me standing in the middle of that massacre. I sprinted back to my car and sped down the street towards town. The coroner attributed Walter's death to a drinking and driving accident, although there was, understandably, a lot of suspicion regarding the odd circumstances surrounding his demise. The autopsy revealed no evidence of the slimy bug that the pastel man had placed in Walter's throat. The town was devastated. I remember a candlelit vigil was held in his honor. A couple of big news outlets covered his death because of Walter's status as the elite college football recruit. My father made a complete recovery, and just a couple of days after his stroke, was released from the hospital. I would go on to graduate high school and meet the love of my life the very first semester at my university. Her name was Djenna. She was the most beautiful girl I had ever seen. We married shortly after college, settled down, and had a wonderful boy named Matthew. However, I never forgot the hand that I played in Walter's death. I have carried that guilt with me since the event of that night. No matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't forget the pastel man. It must have seen me as an easy patsy, because the creature had come to me again and again every time a loved one had been on the brink of death, offering me the same deal that I had accepted that first shameful night. Though the creature had been persistent in its pursuit of bloodlust, the image of Walter's gruesome death never left my mind and gave me the strength to say no to its propositions. Even years later, on the eve of my father's passing, I was able to refuse its proposal when the pastel man visited me in the hospital room. I've been cursed to have my soul tested till the day that I die by the pastel man. A test that for years I was able to persevere through, until one evening where my life began crumbling down and once more the creature took advantage of me in a moment of weakness. Djenna and Matthew were on their way back from the airport after visiting my in-laws. I was swamped at work and had to pull an all-nighter in order to finish a project by its deadline, so my wife hailed a taxi rather than asking me to pick them up. It was around midnight and I was alone in the office when I got a call from the police department. They told me that a drunk driver had collided with their cab on the highway coming back from the airport, and my wife and the cabbie were killed on impact and my son was in critical condition. I sat there at my desk, unable to move or formulate a coherent thought. It was then that I realized that I wasn't by myself in the office anymore. Perched atop my boss's desk was the pastel man. That abhorrent smile still painted across its nasty, wrinkled face. It didn't need to make an offer. This, I believe, the creature already knew. Can you save them? Yes. And no. What do you mean? Just spit it out. The pastel man's smirk disappeared, and I could tell that it was not pleased with my tone of voice. Memories of the vice grip that it had on my face the last time I demanded something from the creature bled into my consciousness. Perhaps it realized I was past the point of threats, because instead of lunging at me as the creature had done in the past, it decided to clarify its cryptic response. I cannot pull someone back from death's clutches, only save them before it gets a hold of them. Your wife is dead. Now make your peace with that. Your son's life, on the other hand, can be salvaged. For a price, of course. I racked my mind. I couldn't think of a single person in my life who deserved to die at the hands of that pale blue monstrosity. Even someone as awful as Walter didn't deserve that gruesome fate that he received that night due to my poor decision. But my son was all that I had now, and he didn't deserve to die either, not because someone else had made a poor decision that evening and got behind the wheel of a car they were too intoxicated to drive. The pastel man's glorious voice filled the room again. I seemed to be hearing it from all directions. The drunk driver that crashed into your family's cab is still alive, and in the very same hospital as your son. Why not him? For the first time that evening, I looked into the big pink eyes of the creature. You said it had to be someone I know. Semantics! It just needs to be someone who has directly impacted your life. The moment that he drove his car into your wife and your son's taxi, he became a candidate. The pastel man flared at the tiny holes on its face with glee, the way it always did when it was content with itself. Fine. Let's do it, I said. I shook its giant hand to make the agreement official, and with that the pastel man gave me the instruction to complete our deal. When I met the doctors at the hospital, they updated me on the condition of my son. We've done all we can, but he's a fighter. The doctors feigned optimism, but I could see in their eyes they didn't expect him to make it through the night. They led me to his room and gave me some time alone with him. The pastel man was already there when I entered, smiling down on his broken body, and quickly I shut the door behind me and nodded to the creature. It reached a gangly arm into its satchel and pulled out the same type of strange-looking insect that had shoved down my father's throat. I opened Matthew's mouth, and with 2 grubby fingers the creature crammed the bug deep into his oral cavity. He will make a full recovery. Now, it's your turn. The pastel man waltzed behind the hospital curtain in my son's room. I knew I didn't have to check to see if he had disappeared, if it were to make another appearance at the hospital that evening. Then it would be because I spoke his name. When I agreed to the bargain at my office, the pastel man had told me what room the driver was being kept in. His injuries were far less severe than Matthew's, so he was in a different wing of the hospital. I could feel my heart pounding as I made my way towards his room. With each step, the beating of my chest grew louder. Already, that same feeling of guilt I had felt when I was looking at Walter's corpse lying in the middle of the road washed over me. I was about to take another person's life. Who was I to decide whether someone deserved to live or die? I felt just as ugly and horrible as the pastel man looked. Maybe I didn't have pointed teeth or wrinkled blue skin, but if I knew I went through with our deal, then I was just as big a monster as it was. I stepped as stealthily as possible through the door, hoping no one would notice me sneak in. As I looked down at the face of the driver lying unconscious in his bed, I instantly felt the familiar sickness in my stomach. He was a boy. No older than Walter the night the pastel man and myself unfairly snuffed out his life before it truly had a chance to shine. Walter could have become someone different when he matured. Someone capable of doing really good things in this world, but he never was given the opportunity. This driver was just a stupid teenager who made a mistake. One that he'd never get the chance to atone for. I saw Walter in the boy's face, and my stomach began to churn more. I tried to call out the pastel man's name, but I couldn't. Perhaps that little angel on my shoulder wouldn't allow me. I would not be responsible for the death of another boy. Not this time. I refused to pull the trigger.
I walked out of his room and didn't look back. I spent the rest of the evening sitting next to my son's bed. The first few rays of morning sunlight snuck into Matthew's hospital room and caught my attention. I peeked through the blinds and watched the sun rise for the first time since the night that Walter died. It was beautiful. The pink ribbon that lined the horizon had bled into the sky, creating a dazzling purple hue. I had my light show, and it was spectacular. I broke my deal with the pastel man, and in doing so, my fate now rested in its filthy hands. Hands that it likely plans to bury into my abdomen. On the plus side, my son will recover in full. It'll be hard for him growing up without his parents, but he's always been close with his aunt. My wife's sister is a wonderful woman with a caring family. She's his legal godmother and promises us the day that he was born that she would always be there for him. Her husband does well for himself, and they've never had a problem with money. The life insurance policy Diana and I took out, combined with the money that we had been putting away for Matthew to go to college, will ensure that there should be no financial issues while he's under their care. It's only a matter of time before the pastel man comes for me. I have accepted that my death is near, but I'm not scared. In a way, I look forward to it. It's almost as if the boy that died within me on that terrible night has been given another chance. When I die, all the guilt and hate that I've had for myself dies with me, wiped away so that my soul can cross over to a new plane of existence, pure and innocent, the way it was before I ever met that monster. One must die, so another shall live. That's what the pastel man said.